Nothing.
Anything to click there?
No.
Is your camera on? No, is your, where's your video's off? Yes or no?
Okay, Janelle, you should see me now.
Yes, we can see you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, hopefully I'm
All
looking good. Okay.
Looking great.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We're going to start with an introduction from Airport's Fire Chief, Jacob Martinez.
Okay, good morning. I want to thank and welcome everybody for participating in our 8th annual wildlife workshop. We're fortunate to have USDA as a partner and help put this whole thing together about various speakers and so forth. On behalf of the Director of Transportation in the Airports Division and Operations Officer Alex Tamoria, we welcome you and we look forward to 2 days of exciting presentations. And we also want to acknowledge the Presidential Award that was given to, well, will be shortly given to the USDA group for their work at the Kauai. And Janelle, all yours.
Great. Thank you, Chief Jacobs. So yeah, we're very excited to be here and to have you here today. We have a great lineup of speakers over the next 2 days. My name is Janelle Sharhag. I am an airport wildlife biologist with USDA Wildlife Services, and I will be the moderator for this event. This year, our theme is the downlisting or reclassification of endangered species in Hawaii. We have 2 great speakers, Carrie Harrington and Ray McGuire, who will be discussing reclassified species. But we also have a variety of other topics, from access deer on Maui to habitat conservation plans to rose-ring parakeets. And this morning, to start, as many of you know, the recent Maui drought caused an increase in access deer issues. Our first presenter, Dr. Kurt Verkauteren, a supervisory wildlife biologist with the National Wildlife Research Center, is going to talk to us about how we can better exclude deer from airport movement areas. Kurt is an expert in human-wildlife conflict and has done extensive research on deer, wild pigs, and wildlife diseases. Welcome, Kurt. I'd like to ask you to please turn on your camera and present your screen.
Okay. Oh, I lost how to share my screen. I just went ahead.
So it's the green button on the bottom that says share screen. If you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, there's a toolbar, and right in the middle of that toolbar is a green icon that says share screen. You're muted, Kurt.
Well, I thought I had it. Sorry here.
It's okay.
Good to go?
Yep, good to go.
Okay. Well, hey, hello from Colorado. I appreciate the invite. When Janelle gave me a call to ask if I'd be willing to talk about deer, I can't pass up a chance to talk about deer. You know, my first half of my career with Wildlife Services was primarily all deer work, a lot of it related to fencing and frightening devices, ways to keep deer from getting themselves in trouble. I kind of like being called Dr. Deer. But for the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 years, I've been doing more of this pig stuff. So now I went from being Dr. Deer to the pig guy. So it's fun to be able to dust off some of that old deer stuff and chat about it. So what Janelle asked me to talk about would be excluding deer from airports. So I'll talk about what I know related to what the work that my group and I have done over the years, which is mostly all focused on whitetails, realizing you guys are more concerned with access deer, but I think they're quite comparable. and we can chat some of what any differences and ways to maybe optimize some of the stuff that we've done in the past to assist you with access type issues. And my co-author on this paper is Mike Lavelle. Mike's a biologist who's been working with me since the beginning. I think I hired him in 2002 or so, and he's just been my right hand for study after study throughout those deer days and now into these pig days. And as you know, guys know better than I do, over the last century, ever since Orville and Wilbur hit that first kitty and hawk, there's been hundreds of lives lost, billions of dollars of damage to aircraft due to wildlife, and specifically from deer. There's over 1,100 collisions from 1990 to 2015. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the FAA circulars and cert alerts that provide guidance for mitigating wildlife risk. And I've looked those over, and I have some in the back of this presentation. And those are good. They're very conservative. If you follow those, you're going to be just fine related to deer issues, I think. A lot of the work that I've focused on in the past is more related to trying to reduce deer damage to agriculture or transmission of diseases from deer to livestock. And for there's more of a balance. How strong of a fence do you need to invest in to protect the resource? A $10,000 fence to protect $3 a bushel soybeans may take a long time to pay off. But in your case, in these airport issues, I think the value of what's at stake, right? Human lives and aircraft that cost, hundreds of tens of thousands of dollars, makes it a no-brainer that a large level of protection, high level, is really, really needed to prevent that risk, lessen that risk. And in Hawaii, of course, you guys have all kinds of crazy feral ungulates that you need to be thinking about. We'll focus on axis deer here, but you've got some other species like the goat in the middle that with their unique abilities to climb and things, they can really get over fences. Other species you've got there, the wild pigs, the feral swine, really good at burrowing under fences, finding their way in. You've got the different species of sheep. You got bovines. You've got quite a variety of ungulates that you've got to really be thinking about related to their unique capabilities and how they could find themselves inside of an airport facility. Related to access, like I say, I'm going to be comparing them pretty directly to white-tailed deer, realizing that may not be apples to apples in all cases. Their sizes are about the same as white-tailed deer and even our mule deer, which we also have done a lot of work on in the past. But as I look at how the habitats of the axis deer and how they seem to move, and they don't stop like the mule deer, they gallop more like the white-tailed deer. They seem to jump more like white-tailed deer, making me think they're more equivalent, probably have better jumping abilities than the mule deer that I've got in my backyard here right now. They were introduced, well over 100 years ago to some of your islands, as recently as 1959 to Maui. And of course, they represent risks to aircrafts on airfields. Now, I'm not sure to what extent, but surely there's deer vehicle collisions throughout the islands that have access deer. And I have had calls in the past. We had done some work to talk about a strategy to commercially harvest wildlife, white-tailed deer in the States and CONUS. And we had done some work in the past with some folks in Hawaii about inventing a program similar to that on access deer, meaning they're definitely overabundant in some areas if they're trying to think of real inventive ways to reduce populations beyond just recreational hunting. And that would be related to those deer vehicle collisions, damage to native plant species, as well as agricultural kind of plants. And I throw disease transmission in there because that's always a potential issue too, especially in a state like yours that sometimes has bovine tuberculosis popping up. So axis deer are primarily grazers as opposed to browsers, which some other species of deer are. And so that could make them attracted to airfields, right? Grazers are looking for primarily newly sprouted grass shoots. They're going to be going for turf, which of course oftentimes is a primary cover on airfields. So things to make those airfields less attractive to grazers would help reduce that motivation for access to get onto a facility. Also, the literature suggests that they need to have open water, probably more so than other deer species from what I read. So if this is true that they do require open water a time or two a day, omitting the availability of water on airfields would reduce the preference of access deer to those kinds of areas. So that'd be a really good strategy. Not allowing them to have access to any water on the airfield could reduce the ability for them to be there. And also, like whitetails, they do seem to habituate quite quickly to novel sights and sounds, meaning frightening devices. Hazing may work for a short time, but there'd have to be some follow-up, some pain or distress, some true fear reinforced once in a while for those kinds of techniques to stick very well with access deer. We're seeing that they usually prefer to pass under high fences rather than over. I'll talk about the work we've done to see how high deer can jump, how high fences need to be. But with access, looking at, there's some data from Texas, for example, where they're feral on the outside of fences now, but they're also behind a lot of fences. And talking with some of those folks, what they're apt to do is squirt under fences where they aren't close to the ground. Maybe there's some bit of a washout, or through any hole in fences that have been created. They seem to prefer that versus trying to go over. And then I mentioned that one-way gates can effectively allow them to return to where they came from. And throughout the Western US right now, there's really a big push on fencing interstates to keep native ungulates here, which is primarily pronghorn, mule deer, and elk, and in some cases whitetails, from getting on interstate highways and things. And so there's a lot of high tensile fence. And then they've got these ramps and different styles of one-way gates to let the animals that do find themselves in between the fences along a highway to get themselves back out. So those are always important to install in any airport facility too, probably, with the addition of having the tool of being able to just remove them lethally if and when you find them on the property. So the methods that we've evaluated and kind of tested and invented over the years for excluding ungulates fit into three different categories. I consider one psychological. That's like the use of frightening devices and repellents, where you're trying to scare them, something scary, elicit fear, keep them out of the area. Biological is where we use animals to manage animals. The work that we've done related to that is we kind of retrained livestock protection dogs to stay with cattle to keep potentially disease-infected deer. In this case, it was bovine tuberculosis in the state of Michigan that had gotten into the wild deer. So of course, they're trying to give it back to the cows. And so we use dogs with the cattle, and they do a really good job. It's not being used operationally all over. Do a really good job at three different levels, really, of keeping the deer from coming into direct contact with cows, keeping the deer from coming into direct contact with feed meant for cows, and even keeping them out of entire pastures. So I could see for a small airstrip somewhere where fencing is really not an option. The use of dogs, like Chad Wickham's going to be talking about later in this conference, for hazing geese, maybe going through with the dog or some other kind of hazing device, with the psychological ones, shell crackers or something, could be used prior to planes coming in an area where maybe you've got cover coming up close to the landing strip, and it's just a small little area where there really isn't much to keep the wildlife off. Something to get them alert, maybe push them back in the woods a little bit, might be a good strategy for you. And then the main thing, of course, at airports is going to be fencing. I'll talk most about fencing strategies that we've used over the years and how they could apply in your situations. So Fences can be considered both a physical and a psychological barrier. I say that because we have a lot of success with electric fences, and they can really be used to reinforce existing woven wire fence and keep animals from even pressuring that woven wire fence. And that's a mind thing. I've got examples of some studies that we've done where the first time that elk, and sometimes even rutting bull elk, want to come to the fence to meet another rutting bull elk on the other side. And if they get 9,000 volts to the oral nasal region, they learn. I've taught elk this, and they weren't exposed to electric fence again for a whole other year. Put it back in front of them, and they won't touch it. So it really has a lasting memory for them. So that can be so electric does have a role in some scenarios. It's cheaper. It can reinforce existing woven wire, and if the animals are resident, so it's the same animals they're trying to keep out all the time, they can learn it and learn to respect it. Of course, along with fences, which you guys probably always hear is, but it's just too expensive. Yes, fencing is costly. Doing it right is costly. Some places may not like the Stalag appearance of a visually obtrusive fence, and of course they require maintenance. If it's not taken care of, it's not going to be effective. So it takes routine scheduling to be making sure that it's maintained properly. Of course, they're always vulnerable to catastrophic events, and in Hawaii, you've got a lot of wind, sometimes a lot of rain and things. So it does have to be kind of babysat. And the beauty of it is fencing can always be erected in such a way you can overcome the capabilities of those animals that you're targeting, right? Some of those challenges that we've kind of addressed over the years that you got to watch out for with any kind of fencing is, for example, vegetation overgrowing it, trees falling on it, and smashing to the ground, making it so that animals can cross it. Maybe smaller animals burrow under it, which create larger openings that then coyotes get in. Now it's big enough that maybe a deer or a pig could get in it. All it has to be watched for. Natural weather events like the middle here, flooding can take a fence out. In your backyard, maybe in some spots, there's potential that it could be lava issues. In my backyard right now, we've got some of those nice fences newly erected along interstates that would do a great job on an airfield too. But right now, they're not really doing us much good because mudslides have totally wiped them out, right? So now that's going to allow deer and elk in that part of Colorado onto that interstate project. You also have to think about the effective height of a fence. This picture here in the upper right, this is an 8-foot tall woven wire fence to keep captive elk in at a study site that I was working on in Colorado. And in any given day in the winter, it's not a very effective fence if you can walk on top of the crusty snow and it's only 2.5 feet high, right? And you got to think about the abilities of the animals. Here's some examples of deer squirting under a woven wire fence. With the species that you guys have, goats, of course, are really quite the climbers. On the left there, that was a study that we were doing in Estes Park, Colorado, and the top picture is a mule deer doe squirting underneath the fence, and there's a gap there, squirting underneath the gap of the fence. And then the lower picture, you can't see the rack very well, but it was a Boone and Crockett size buck, a real big mule deer buck. He wasn't going to try and squeeze under that fence with that big rack. And it was 5.5 feet at the highest point, and he just popped himself over it. That was a fence we invented to keep elk out, but let wild everything else, mule deer, bears, everything smaller, come and go to protect aspen groves from elk. That lower left-hand picture relates to a study that we did evaluating how high white-tailed deer can really jump. And I'll get into that study in just a minute here. Some work that doesn't apply directly in an instance like yours, where you care so deeply about protecting human life and the value of airplanes, but helps you kind of think about the cost of fencing and making those decisions. Is years ago we made this best fence selection model to help producers, agriculture producers, wrap their head around the value of a fence, because it seems so hard for somebody to want to put that upfront expense in to a fence when they can't see the return for it. And what this model did is it would allow producers to input the all the details associated with their perimeter, the value of the crop, the level of protection of the fence, past year's damage, and it helps them wrap their head around, okay, if I do invest in this $10,000 fence, I'm getting this amount of damage every year, that fence will pay for itself in 5 years or whatever. And it's a woven wire fence, so it's going to last me, 25 years. So it's a good investment and help them make their minds up. For years, I supported this model, but it was back in the day. I was actually sending it out on CDs for years after it was published. I'm not supporting it anymore, but there's still a lot of college classes and things that use this model to help students wrap their head around the benefits and costs of fencing related to wildlife damage. But the biggest thing you got to be thinking about with keeping deer, other ungulates out, any species really, is their level of motivation. If they aren't very motivated to get to your resource, the airfield, they aren't going to try very hard. It doesn't take as much of a fence or an effort to keep them out. So you got to do what you can to make them not very motivated. But if they are motivated, then how strong does the barrier have to be? That introduces a study where we, like I mentioned, looked at how high deer can jump. This became very important in CONUS when chronic wasting disease went from being an issue in the western U.S. It all of a sudden jumped to Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and it was in Wisconsin. And so we needed to determine how high fences needed to be to prevent deer movement. The focus of this was mainly high fence deer operations to prevent wild deer from getting in and captive tame deer from getting out. And to evaluate that, we did a study where we really messed with the motivation of the deer to see what their true abilities really topped out at. And we did this study in northern Wisconsin, where first we built the pen. We used 12-foot tall woven wire to build this perimeter of this pen, put shade cloth on in areas near where we had a cross fence, which is the bottom right-hand picture. You can see there's a 2-foot fence there. This is a cross fence. And we taught these deer how to jump the fence. So we went out, we caught 22 wild deer, put them in this big pen, and for this first experiment, we trained them up. So they weren't just put in there without kind of learning what we wanted them to do, but we taught them to go across the fence. All they do is jump to the other side and they'd be left alone, right? So how that looked, and to give you a hint of how high I was thinking they might end up going by the end, that fence was 12 feet that we put up around the perimeter. And in the end, we put another, we put some of this barrier tensar fencing around the top to make it look higher yet. So the fence was actually 13.5 feet high. After all the anecdotal observations and things that we've heard over the years, we were thinking that the deer might go higher than just that original 10, 12 foot tall fence. And here's the cross fence. So what we did is we started out at 3 feet, and we would put this fence at a new height every week, right? So like on Thursday, we put it up at 3 feet to start with. We let the animals alone until the next Thursday, and we went in with just humans on one side, had all the deer on one side with humans, kind of walked toward that cross fence. They jumped the fence. We laid off and backed off. Well, the next day with those dogs in this previous slide, that look kind of like wolves or just huskies, of course, but we wanted to, have that predator for maximum motivation. And so we did this week after week, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, and everything went real smooth for these deer up and past 6 feet. Most of the deer made 6 feet, but that's when we had our first deer that weren't willing to jump it. And once we got to 7 feet, the majority of the deer, white-tailed deer in this case, and this is a big subspecies, Ortocoilus virginianus borealis, the ones in the northern Great Lakes states. they weren't able to be jumping the fence once it got to be 7 feet and higher. And when we got to that 6 feet, I was on a different study in Washington, and my guys called, boy, we couldn't give them to jump 7 feet. So I thought, oh, they just didn't push hard enough, right? So we did it again the next week. Same result. We had one deer that could do it, or a couple deer that could do it, but not the rest. So we did some more experiments where we turned all those deer out, where we just caught some wild deer, didn't do a whole training regimen, and just saw, could they jump 8 feet? And through all these reps, we could not get a white-tailed deer to jump an 8-foot tall fence. Now, I've been hearing for years how people had seen them jump 8-foot fence and 10-foot fences. So as part of this effort, then we did a survey out to all of our wildlife services operations biologists who see deer along fences a lot, all of our airport biologists, other white-tailed deer biologists from state agencies. And I surveyed over 150 different biologists, and 6 of them, so I believe those 6, they say they saw a deer jump an 8-foot fence, so they probably did, right? So it can happen, but an 8-foot fence is going to keep the vast majority out. So if you go to 10 and it's a maintained fence, I'm pretty positive that's going to be essentially 100% effective. Also, you got to think about different situations within the fence that come up. For example, you always are going to need gates, of course, at an airfield. And over the years, we have tested a few different things. For example, this upper right-hand corner, that's a style of cattle guard that we tried. These are essentially conveyor belt sections. So when the deer tries to walk over this cattle guard looking thing, it's a tube that rolls, right? So they can't get purchase on it. And those worked pretty okay, but I never suggested them to be used operationally, realizing that there's chances for broken legs and things. We just didn't like it. We didn't have any injuries during our studies, but the potential was there. So we kind of backed off of that idea. Another one on the same lines here, lower left, is the electromat. And our Sandusky, Ohio field station did some work with this one. I did some work early in Washington with it, and then they did some more work. And so it's got electricity going through with the idea that they get a shock through their feet and go back. It did have some potential, but I think it just isn't going to be strong enough for the kind of issues that we're dealing with on airfields. So some kind of a permanent gate is probably your best option. And from our experience, all of our work in Michigan and things where we're fencing farmers' properties, the weakest link in our fences is always the gate. So you need some kind of an automatic gate that's going to open and close without having the employee have to get in and out of the truck. And this picture here in the middle is of a bump gate. This is an automatic closing gate that works pretty well, where you drive up to it, bump this in the middle there, bump that cushion piece of bar with the bumper of your vehicle. The gate pops open. You've got time to drive through if you have a trailer, and then it shuts and latches. And nowadays, I'm sure there's several different variations of electric gates that could be used, that could be powered with solar on an airfield. Maybe you can run power to them. So some kind of a permanent gate that's not left open is really needed. We've got plenty of examples of how even if the producer of farmers in these cases left a gate open, just for an hour at noon when I went in for lunch, surely no deer will get in there. And our trail cameras tell different. They always find a way. If the gate's open, you're going to have trouble. And then these CERT alerts that I'm sure you guys are familiar with. I mentioned how I like how these things are written. They're really science-based and they're being cautious. So with the FAA recommending 10-foot chain link fencing, chain link or woven wire or a heavy V-mesh with barbed wire outriggings on top, the fact that we can't get a white-tailed deer under extreme motivation to jump 8 feet lets me know that this 10 feet is very secure. So properly maintained, that fence recommendation is just fantastic. And then the recommendation for the skirt, a 4 to 5 foot skirt of fencing material, attached to the bottom of the fence and buried at a 45-degree angle outside. That's perfect. That would, of course, prevent your wild pigs and your coyotes and other things from being able to get in that that fence. So this is really a sound recommendation. I'd be interested to know what percentage of airports have such great fences. That's really good. Other kind of recommendations that all make perfect sense, of course, are that those fence lines have to be kept free of any excess vegetation. It's good to just use an herbicide on both sides of those fences so that it's easy just skirting the perimeter routinely to catch if there's any spots that need attention. You know, washouts, breaks, holes in the fence that are caused by whatever need to be repaired as soon as they're discovered. There's also some recommendations relative to the gates that are given in those cert alerts, talking about no smaller than 8-inch gap or 6-inch gaps. I think that's pretty good advice. You know, that could let some small piglets and things through, but not too bad. If it's a tight fence and you got some gaps around your gate, as long as they're really minimal, it'll work just fine for you. So beyond that, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this book that was put out by our researchers from our Sandusky, Ohio field station that focuses so much on airport issues. I like the way that it's stated in the book that airports should simply accept the cost and erect the most substantial fence available to them, because that's what it'll take to really reduce that risk. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions anybody has, any comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Kurt. So for questions, what we can do is one of two things. You can type your question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I'll be able to see you and let you verbally ask your question. You can also use the Q&A button, but chat or Q&A are the ways to type it in.
I see a question there, Janelle. Is there a style or design of one-way gate you like for access? And we worked on some of these years ago, some fancy ones made out of rebar, and one was kind of curved plexiglass. But I think the simplest idea that all these Western states are putting along their highways, just because it probably is the most foolproof, is on the inside is to build a berm, essentially a ramp up to the fence. So it's a ramp up to the fence, and then it's a drop off on the outside, right? So the animal can easily go up that little ramp, like when pressured by us, with a few guys kind of pushing it, and then they jump off that ramp. And I really bought into that style when I was doing some pig work in Australia a couple of years ago, and they had these traps around water holes where they're trying to catch feral goats. And that's exactly how they're letting goats. So they would put 4-foot woven wire fence around these ponds, right? With like 50 yards off of the pond. So those goats have to get to that water, and they come up those ramps, jump in, and you had them. And they're also catching wild pigs. There are some other crazy animals that they're catching. So I really like that concept the best. I think it's easy to maintain. At one time, kind of make it and you're done. So that's a good strategy.
Great, thank you, Kurt. Monitoring hands here. I'm not seeing any hands up. Kurt, I know you're a great resource, and all that information was really helpful. We have the access deer issues, particularly in Maui County. And so I see some people from Maui County on here. And if they, this is a great time to ask questions to probably one of the leading experts on deer and excluding deer. I think one of the challenges we have is patching those holes. And so do you have any advice about the size of holes, or what needs to be done to really create a good patch for maybe bottom of fence line holes or in fence line holes?
Yeah, I just like if there's the same fencing material that the fence is built out of available, just cut a patch. Usually use hog rings because it's quick and easy, and just circle it. Every 4 inches or so, put a ring, and you can make a really strong patch pretty easily. If it's digging out, if it's a dig under, sometimes you got to do some digging, right, to make sure that that underground skirt is deep enough and proper. So sometimes that can be more work. And that a lot of times is the biggest effort on the front end. So it's hard for people to want to do it, but it's really important. If you do it once right, it'll last a long time.
Great. I see another question coming in. Is the electrical mat low voltage and not impact human contact?
Yeah, so
So I think
it's never been marketed. We were working with a company on that years ago, and it is pretty high voltage, but as long as you got shoes on, you're fine. You can drive right across it. It was a rubber mat with a grate of stainless. So if you touch across, so the idea was a hoof would touch across, and they get a shock and go backwards. And in that experimental setting, it did kind of work. And we could walk right across it in our boots, and it was no big deal. You could drive across it. But where it's going to fail is if a deer sees that opening and they're motivated because they've been scared by a vehicle or a dog or something, and they're going at a good clip, they would run right across that, right? And they might take the shock, and since their momentum is going forward, they're still going to go right across. So we never really pursued it much beyond that point. And I went back to the idea of always having a physical barrier, even for your gate. There are ideas that could come up. I know that people just don't like gates a lot of times. So there are strategies that we could look into that I just haven't got to yet. For example, we got some ramp ideas where it could be a ramp of like horizontal bars with a gap between them that a deer may not be able to climb and get over. But I look at some of your animals and the ones that are in my mind that we thought about testing but never have yet, I think goats could figure it out.
yeah, probably. All right, check in the hands again and the chat box. I'm not seeing any more questions. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kurt. It was a great presentation, and I think we learned a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so next we have Ella Foley-Gannon. But Ella, are you able to hear us, and can we hear you is the question. I know you had some audio problems.
I'm hoping so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, I have a little introduction for you quick. So thank you, Ella. Ella has been representing HDOT for several years and is one of the leading permitting lawyers and an authority on endangered species, wetlands, water quality, and water rights issues. She has assisted HDOT in development of the Kauai Seabird Habitat Conservation Plan, and today is going to be talking with us about the upcoming Maui Seabird Habitat Conservation Plan. Welcome, Ella.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see that?
Not yet, but it might. There we go. There's a little lag always.
Okay, and then let me just, hold on, let me get it so it'll play the, hold on, let me just do this 1 second. Get it in the slideshow mode. Again. Okay. Everything is just being seamless today for me. I am an expert on
It always
endangered
happens.
species, but not on computers. So you have to indulge me. Hold on 1 second. I think I'm going to get there now. Okay, now is that up? Does everyone can see that?
Yes, you're good to go.
Terrific, thank you. And so good morning, everybody. And it's always a pleasure to meet with you and to hear every year what is going on with the airports and get all of the updates. I think this is a incredibly beneficial conference to everybody who's involved. And I'm delighted to be a part of it again. As Janelle said, I will be speaking with you this morning about the conservation plan, the HCP, which is under development for the Maui district facilities for HDOT, including both the airports and the harbors. And so what I'm going to go over this morning with you is to start off with just sort of giving a very high overview of the necessitate the development of the HCP is under both Hawaii state law, the HAR 195D, as well as the Federal Endangered Species Act, Section 4, 7, and 10. I'm then going to talk and walk through the actual permitting process that's involved in developing and obtaining the necessary approval of the HCP itself. Talk about the current status of where we are with the Maui HCP, and then talk about next steps and how those of you who are involved in the facility can help us with this process. So going back to sort of as a basic concept, one of the challenges of dealing with airports, particularly, is that airports have to meet a multitude of requirements. There is not only, obviously, there's the endangered species, which we're going to get to first, but there's obviously the FAA requirements, the certification process, planning, oversight, wildlife management associated with that certification process and environmental review. And most of all, the safety of being able to maintain and operate the facilities. And then there's the TSA requirements. And finally, there is the environmental protections, including the Endangered Species Act. And so one of the challenges we face, which is unique to a number of other projects that I work on throughout the country, is all of these different layers of requirements which you have to, the different masters that all of you have to be able to meet and to take into account. And so uniquely in many ways in these situations is that the endangered species protection, while required and necessary, can't always be paramount. There are other considerations which often have to, which can be more critical and can outweigh those considerations and therefore do present challenges for how we make the facilities therefore kind of fit into the endangered species regulatory requirements. So we'll talk about the permitting process now under both the Federal Endangered Species Act and under Hawaii state law. So when we look at the Federal Endangered Species Act, the first thing for the species that we'll be talking about, which in this context for the airports is really the seabirds, is the major consideration, and those are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So under the Endangered Species Act, there's kind of four major provisions that sort of drive the permitting considerations. The first is the listing of species, and that these species can be listed as threatened or endangered. Endangered species under the construct of the Endangered Species Act are given a higher level of protection in practice, and I think many of you may have been aware that there has been some recent what's called downgrading of a species from endangered to threatened, particularly with some of the seabirds. But in practice, for all kind of intents and purposes, that doesn't generally make that much of a difference. In practice, generally, threatened species are afforded equal protection with endangered species. Then there's Section 7, which is the provision of the Act, which requires that before any federal agency can approve or fund or implement any project, it has to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and make a determination about whether that activity has the potential to jeopardize any listed species or result in adverse modification of any designated critical habitat. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this process associated with the wildlife hazards management plans. And those go through with the FAA, those go through the Section 7 consultation, which results in usually the issuance of a biological opinion. And so that is one process, but it also gets involved in the habitat conservation planning efforts, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Then there is Section 9, which is the provision of the Endangered Species Act, which sets kind of the limits of what can happen. And this is the sort of basic prohibition against any taking of any listed species without a permit. And as I'm sure everyone here is very much aware of, take is a very broadly defined term under federal law and under state law. And it includes not only the actual harming or killing of a species, but it can also be things like habitat modification or things which considered that disrupt the normal behavior of the species so much that it could jeopardize its existence. So it's a very broad term and a very broad blanket prohibition. It just says flat that there can't be any take unless there has been a permit issued, and any take that occurs without a permit is considered to be a violation of federal law and state laws. We'll get to in a minute. And then Section 10, which is the one that is really operative for what we're talking about today, is the provision which allows for non-federal agencies to get a license to be able to take listed species. And it requires the development and approval of what's called a habitat conservation plan. So going into more specifically about what does a habitat conservation plan require, and this is what we are in the process of developing for Maui right now, and what we've already gotten approved under the KSHCP for Kauai and the Lanai Airport and the harbor's facilities on Kauai. So as I said, Section 10 provides a basic pathway for non-federal agencies to be able to get an in-still take permit so that they can lawfully carry out an activity which has the chance to incidentally result in the take or harm to a listed species. What does it require? It requires that impacts to that species are minimized and that they practically can, and that the remaining effects are mitigated to the maximum extent practicable. It requires that there be funding assurances to be carried out, to be demonstrated from the outset that the applicant will be able to carry out all of the proposals versus the mitigation measures, the minimization measures, all of the activities that are going to be described in the habitat conservation plan. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. This does provide some challenges for government agencies because unlike private businesses, we are dependent upon the authorization from the legislature on an annual or biannual basis. So we can't give the same level of funding assurances that a private entity would be giving. All we can sort of commit to is that we will ask the legislature each year to provide the funding that will be necessary to carry out the program. And that has been deemed to be an acceptable level of assurances under both the state and federal law. We also have to address kind of unforeseen circumstances, and there is what's called the no surprises rule. So once we have a plan in place and we make mitigation commitments, that's all we have to carry out. So there won't be any surprises if things don't necessarily happen the way we think that they would, as long as we're doing what we were obligated to do. The applicant, this is a voluntary process. It's something that the applicant gets to define the scope of the activities covered. It gets to ask for how long it wants its permit to be. In terms of the KSHCP and what we're looking to do at Maui, we are looking for like a 30-year permit term. So that we can have, a pretty good sound level of assurances going forward, that we know what has to be done, we know how to do it, we know what's going to be required, and we don't have to be revisiting this on a regular basis. There is the requirement that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comply with NEPA. before it approves habitat conservation plan. So it has to do the environmental review, and that has to go through the public comment process, which again, we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. There are different kinds of HCPs. There is a minimal effect HCP, which is supposed to be an abbreviated process for activities that only have very minimal effects on listed species. In practice, those have been pretty hard to obtain to make it really be an abbreviated process. This is a very complex and lengthy process in most instances and practices. Then there are regional HCPs, which can cover, as I said, a broader range of activities with different applicants, multiple applicants. It can be run by like a local jurisdiction that can then give the take authorization to numerous activities. For our purposes now, we will be looking at a single plan HCP, and in many ways, the QI HCP, as I think everybody is aware of, involves a broader range of interest. And this was largely driven by the fact that the mitigation that was required is pretty considerable, and it needed to have sort of a pooling of resources to have it make sense or to be practicable for anybody to actually carry it out. That also, though, created a number of complexities because we weren't just getting a permit for harbors and for the airport, but we were also working together with all of the resorts and with the county and with some other parties. And so there's all the permutations that go with that. An advantage for the Maui district is that we are not going that pathway because we have a mitigation strategy which we've been able to identify that we think we can carry out independently. And so therefore, we are hopeful it's going to be a much easier process. As I think probably everybody here is aware of, the Kauai HCP, from start to finish, took about 20 years. And we're hoping that the Maui HCP is going to take about a year. So it's quite a different scope and context. So going forward, just again, to just kind of reiterate, so what is it that we have to be able to demonstrate to get an HCP approved? Well, under Section 10A2B of the Endangered Species Act, we have to show that the take that will occur for our purposes to seabirds will be incidental to the activities of operating the airports and operating the harbors. It's not the purpose of those activities, it's incidental to those activities. We have to demonstrate that to the maximum extent practical, we are going to minimize and mitigate the impacts of the taking. So again, we will have that adequate funding, which I talked about a few minutes ago, and that the take will appreciably reduce the likelihood of survival and recovery of the species in the wild. So that's kind of the absolute standard that we have to meet. They can't approve any activity that's going to likely result in jeopardy to a species, and we shouldn't have any problem with that standard in Maui or in anything else that we're dealing with. And then the secretary has the ability to put additional requirements that they feel is necessary to protect the species. So the major issues that we have to deal with in this permitting process at the airport specifically is we have to address how we're going to deal with the lighting, because that's the primary activity that we're worried about. That's the thing that impacts the species. That's what can result in take to the seabirds. And so it's assessing the lighting as it is currently configured on the facility, as well as any modifications that may be deemed necessary to minimize the impacts as we discussed above to be able to make those findings so we can get the HCP. We have challenges versus dealing with both the public areas of the airport, so where like the rental car facilities are and things that are under the control but not the direct control of HDOT. So those present specific challenges. We also have the challenges that in the non-public areas, there is limited access about who can be present there and carrying out the various tasks that have to be done. Predator control is a big component of what we need to be able to demonstrate we're going to be able to address, because one of the main concerns is if we end up with downed seabirds, which generally do happen during the fledgling season to some extent. That if there are predators present on the facility, you know, primarily cats are the biggest concern. They can result in the take of the species, because once the you know, there's a bird that's been down on the ground, if there's a feral cat that's present, that can obviously result in a take of that species. And then we have all of the monitoring that needs to be done. The monitoring of the predators, the monitoring of downed seabirds, the monitoring of the whole facility, making sure that the lighting is being done, and all of the requirements that will ultimately be included in the plan are carried out successfully. Or if there is a problem, to be able to identify that in real time and figure out a way to address that. And I will say with a lot of these aspects, later this morning, Greg from HT Harvey is going to be making a presentation on how HDOT is implementing these measures under the KSHCP, and I think that can be very informative for those who are involved in the Maui district about what's going to be required under this proposal and the plan that's eventually approved, hopefully in the near term. Then there's obviously the mitigation, and part of that is being able to identify how much mitigation has to be provided, where it's going to be provided, what kind of site control do we have to have? Is it just funding that we have to provide? As I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate that there are a number of options on Maui where there has been seabird mitigation, which has been implemented for other projects. That are kind of coming to the end of their permitting requirements. So there is an opportunity to step in the shoes of some of those established activities. So it'll be a much simpler and hopefully cleaner and easier mitigation requirement that will be, you know, more akin to just having to provide funding rather than having to get something up and running and demonstrating it's being successful. So that should greatly facilitate our ability to move through the permitting process. And then there is adaptive management, which is as a result of kind of the monitoring that we're doing. Again, if there's things that are not successful, or if there's problems that we see as things are evolving, that we will have processes whereby we alter what's happening on the airport to address those. And to take into account kind of the lessons learned through the implementation of these programs and other programs. And then just going to the state requirements, which is found at HAR 195B. And it was very, we don't have to go through this in great detail because it really was modeled on the federal program. And there is, so there's great similarities between the listing of the species, the definition of take, the prohibitions on the take, and what you need to be able to do to be able to get an HCP and get what's known as an in-fill take license rather than a permit under state law. There are a couple of things that are slightly more, it can be defined as slightly more onerous under state law versus federal law. And most specifically that they have to be able to demonstrate that there's going to be a net recovery benefit for the affected species. So that's a so much higher bar that has to be demonstrated to be able to get the equivalent licensing under state law. So the permitting process that we're undertaking for Maui, the parties that will be involved in this process. We have the applicant, which is HDOT. Well, as I indicated earlier, the airports and the harbors together in one single application. You have the Department of Land and Natural Resources, or DNLR. You have Fish and Wildlife Service for the federal permitting. You have the ESRC, the Endangered Species Recovery Committee, who are involved in the both the approval and the implementation of the state plan, and have a very they're very active participants in the process and in the specificity of the plan that is ultimately approved by the state agencies. You have the Board of Land and Natural Resources, which has the ultimate approving authority for the state permitting process. The Attorney General's office will be involved. And then there is public participation in all of these various steps that have to be taken, which we'll touch on in just a second. So the permitting process itself, what do you do? well, first off, we're developing a draft HCP. And we're pretty far along this process right now. We're hoping to have the draft of that document done by the end of this month, which we will then submit to DNLR and to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They will then take it, they will review it. We will have kind of ongoing discussions and negotiations about the adequacy of what we've proposed and what we've submitted. They may come back and ask for additional details, or they may have comments about something, its adequacy or not adequacy, or questions, and you know, we may have to have site visits and things like that. So that's a kind of an iterative process that goes on between the applicant team and the agencies. At the same time that is being undertaken, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will need to comply with NEPA, so it will have to develop its environmental document, which will most likely be an environmental impact statement. I'm sorry, I put report there. That's incorrect. It's an environmental impact statement, or EIS. If there is a possibility that they could do it with an EA, if they determine there will be no significant impacts that would happen as a result of approval of the plan. But for planning purposes, we assume that there will be an environmental impact statement required. When that environmental document is done, both the HCP and the NEPA documents will be released for public comment under both the state and federal processes, and the public will be made aware of it, have access to all the documents, and will have an opportunity to submit comments to both of the agencies, which the agencies will then need to take into consideration. And those comments may lead to certain revisions in the documents. And again, as part of that process, there's a back and forth between the agencies and the applicant. There would then be a public hearing that's held on Maui in this case, and the ESRC will have a site visit. There will need to be, they'll have to make sure that the habitat plan meets all of the requirements of both the state and federal law. And there will be this coordinated review. Again, there will be the mitigation requirements, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of overlap between both of these processes. Then there will, so what ultimately happens is, for the state process, the ESRC first has a hearing. It makes recommendations to the board about whether it should approve the HCP or not. BLNR has a meeting. They consider the HCP, and they will make recommendations to the chairperson about whether it should be approved or not. If those are all suggesting approval, the chairperson then makes a decision, and if it approves it, it issues the incidental take license. For the federal process, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service first has to engage in a section consultation with itself about the impact of approving the HCP. As at the end of that process, it will issue a biological opinion, which will allow them, assuming that they find no jeopardy, to approve the HCP. Based upon the biological opinion, the NEPA document, the HCP, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will issue what's called the Record of Decision, which will outline its reasoning and how it views all of these documents and how it makes its determination about how they comply with the various requirements of federal law. And they would then issue that and say, you know, we're approving this. There is a 30-day what's called cooling off period, in which the public can again comment on the documents. And then it would be approved, and there would be an incidental take permit and an incidental take license that would be issued to HDOT that says you can continue to operate these facilities so long as you do it, and even if there is take of the species, that's consistent with federal law, so long as you're complying with all of the requirements of the approved habitat conservation plan. So where are we right now? As I indicated earlier, we're working on the application. We have a draft application for the HCP. We've been very lucky that we were able to benefit from all the good work that was done on the KSHCP. And that, as I said, when Greg goes through it later this afternoon, that can provide a lot of indications about what's involved in that, including the lighting revisions, the education that needs to be done, the monitoring requirements, the predator control, et cetera. We anticipate it's going to be a 30-year permit. It's a joint application with the harbors, and it will cover all of the HDOT facilities in the Maui district. And then just finally, what can everybody do to help? Well, work with if things come up and that are within your jurisdiction and in your purview. Please work with the application team, which is both representatives of the airports and the harbors. HT Harvey is the lead consultant from the environmental perspective. Wildlife Services works closely with us on how these measures should be implemented. And then the Attorney General's office and I work on the legal aspects of this. So please attend the trainings, assist with compliance, and let us know if there's any issues that come up. The more we know in advance, the easier it is for us to address it and to I think I may have gone a little bit long, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So with that, if there's any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Great, thank you, Ella. Yes, and thank you for walking us through that complex process. Even for those of us who are more familiar with it, the nuances can be overwhelming. So again, for those of you that might have questions for Ella, please put them in the chat, or if you'd like to speak, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Okay. Feel free to keep, oh, I see one, sorry. Okay, so Afshin has a question and she was just wondering what species are going to be covered under this HCP?
Yeah, it'll be same. It'll just be the seabirds, same as the Kauai HCP.
And another question from Roy. What role does the County of Maui play in the HCP?
So at this point, they're not playing any official role in the HCP. So as I was saying earlier, unlike on Kauai, where it was a joint plan that applies to multiple entities, including the county and private entities. This is being envisioned as just being a HDOT plan. So, you know, we will continue to coordinate with the county on efforts being undertaken, but and this is largely the distinction because again, there's mitigation options here that don't require kind of the massive amount of funding that was required on Kauai. That we can go it alone, which does make it a much easier lift in terms of both drafting it, getting it approved, and ultimately carrying it out. So if there's ever anything that we need to amend or change because there's changed circumstances, it's much easier if it's just our own facilities that we have to address.
Okay, thank you, Ella. Okay, on to our next speaker. Some of you might not be aware of what our next presenter, Dr. Jane Anderson, is going to be talking about, which is rose-ringed parakeets. In recent years, rose-ringed parakeets have increased population on both Kauai and Oahu. Specialists at H&L have noted them nesting near the airport and Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. We want to highlight this as a possible airport issue in the future. Dr. Anderson is an assistant professor of research at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M and has been leading a study on rose-ringed parakeet on Kauai since 2019. Welcome, Jane. If you could turn on your video and start sharing your screen.
Absolutely. I am getting a pop-up that I need the last presenter to stop sharing before I am allowed to.
Okay. So Ella, there should be a little red button on, you found it, great. Thank you.
Okay, can you see this bird?
Yes, I can.
All right, I'll jump in then. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. I really appreciate it. I would say aloha, but I'm home in Texas, so I'll say howdy. So today I'm going to be talking about management and impacts of rose-ring parakeets on Kauai. And I just want to start out by acknowledging the funding and collaborators on this project. So I've been doing this research for 2 years, and the funding for this work came from 2 pieces of legislation passed by the state legislature, one from the House and one from the Senate. I do this work collaboratively with Wildlife Services and Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center, as well as a collaborator from my institute here in Texas. So it's just me today, but I represent a small army of folks who are working on this issue. So to begin, rose-ring parakeets are a medium-sized parrot. They are native to, what's that there? Equatorial Africa and Asia. You can see this map here on the right, the green area. And they're an IUCN species of least concern. So what this means is that there are plenty of rose-ring parakeets in the world. We don't have any conservation concerns. They are doing just fine. They're about 40 centimeters long, about half of which is their long tail. They're sexually dimorphic. So this means that the adult males and the adult females look differently. So if you check out this picture here, the adult male is in the foreground. He has that dark black and pink ring. That's what the species is named for. And the female's in the background. She does not have that dark ring. So if you see these birds on Hawaii, in any of the Hawaiian Islands, they're pretty noticeable. They are very distinct from native birds or other non-native birds. They're considered one of the most invasive bird species in the world. So if you check out this map, the area in yellow is their native range, and then the black dots are observations all over the place. So you can see there are invasive populations all throughout Western Europe, Japan, Australia, parts of Africa, and the United States. We have reports of rose-ring parakeets, potentially small populations in a few states. We know we have established populations in Southern California, Southern Florida, and Hawaii. So on Hawaii, we have observations on at least 4 islands. So we don't know much about what's going on the Big Island. We have a handful of reports. We're not sure if it's actually an established population, and we're not really sure where they came from or how long they've been there. We just know that folks are saying they see them from time to time. I've been in touch with some folks on Maui who are currently, they have their eyes on 5 parakeets that are roaming around. They captured 1 and they're working on the other 4. And I really admire that they're putting the work into it, because you'll see in this presentation that a few parakeets can turn into many thousands in not that long of a time period. The 2 islands with known populations are Kauai and Oahu. Oahu, the parakeets were introduced in the 1930s, and a population estimate from 2018 suggested there were about 4,700 birds at that time. So the largest and most problematic population in Hawaii is on Kauai. We don't know exactly how many were introduced. There are some sort of urban legends that where they came from. Perhaps some pets were released in the 60s. We think it was maybe just a couple of animals, maybe a few, maybe 2 or 4. The population stayed really small for a few decades and then began growing very rapidly in the early 2000s. And this is really common for invasive species, including several parrot species, that we call this the lag phase, that population stays small until all of a sudden explodes into exponential growth. So folks before me estimated about 2,000 birds in 2011, about 6,800 in 2018, and then my team estimated about 10,500 in 2020. It's important to recognize that these are conservative estimates. I won't go into the details, but the way we estimate birds using this technique is kind of the minimum known number of birds. So it's possible there are more birds than that we don't know about. It's also important to remember, and you'll see in this presentation, that management began in 2005. So we're seeing this large population growth, even though there have been several thousand parakeets removed. So on Kauai, rose-ring parakeets are distributed pretty much throughout the lowlands of the island. So like a lot of Hawaiian islands, the center of the island is high elevation, mountainous. And we see the parakeets in the lowland areas, typically below 500 feet. And we see them in developed areas, residential areas, areas for tourists or commercial areas, as well as the agricultural areas. So one of the most substantial impacts we see from parakeets on Kauai is on the agricultural industry. So this is both on the corn industry, which is largely on the southwestern part of the island, It's dominated by just a few very large companies with these very large sprawling cornfields, as well as the tropical produce industry. And this is more often smaller growers, local growers. And it's everything from lychee, papaya, mango, rambutan, a huge diversity of crops that are getting hit really hard by these birds. The farmers in Kauai have come up with an assortment of really creative solutions with sort of varying levels of efficacy. The problem is that they are expensive and time consuming. So even when they do work, it's quite an effort and not enough in and of itself to control the impacts of these birds. The second main issue we see with the parakeets on Kauai are the roosts. So during the day, the parakeets will split up into, you'll typically just see about a half a dozen at a time. They split up into these small flocks. At night, they congregate together in what we call roosts. So that's the areas where they all get together to sleep. In other parts of the world, sometimes these are just a few hundred birds. On Kauai, they're massive. Typically, we'll see roosts of 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 birds. The largest one we've documented had 6,500 birds in a very, very small area. Typically, these are in urban areas, shopping mall, parking lots, or tourist resorts. They tend to like developed areas with artificial light and lots of planted palms. We most often see them using planted royal palms. As you can imagine, when you get thousands of birds in one very small place, it is loud and there is a lot of poop. And the poop is not only unsightly, but it also is leading to a lot of property damage. We're hearing a lot of folks talk about property damage. And it can also be dangerous. Not only is there the potential for pathogens, but I've also heard reports of the seeds in the droppings attracting rodents. So it's gross, but it's also potentially dangerous. So I'm hoping this video works. This is a video of parakeets departing from a roost in the morning, just to hopefully give an idea of sort of what these massive congregations look and feel like. Well, looks like it's not cooperating, but just pretend you just saw 2,500 birds departing at once. It's loud and overwhelming. So given the nature of today's workshop, I want to talk a little bit about what we know about what's going on with the Lihue Airport. I should mention I am not an airport expert, but Bill Bukowski is on the call today. I know he's one of the attendees, and he is the Kauai District Supervisor for Wildlife Services, and he is absolutely the expert on this. So if folks have specific questions about the airport, I will turn those over to him. We do know that rosary parakeets are an airstrike hazard. At the Heathrow Airport in London, where there is an invasive population of the species, within 1 year, there were 3 documented airstrikes, and all of these included more than 1 bird and cost a lot of money. In Lihue, there are parakeets within the airport operations area. The policy of Wildlife Services is both to lethally remove them when possible and to haze or disperse them using firearms, vehicles, or pyrotechnics. So these data again came from the USDA from just a 5-year period. They lethally removed 117 birds from the airport, and they dispersed over 1,600. And as you can see here, most of these were through firearms, and some of these were also from vehicles. And so Bill can speak to sort of what percentage of their work this looked like, if this is common for among other bird species to see these numbers, but I can imagine it is no small feat to be managing 1,600 birds in a pretty small airport. So I'm going to go over a few management options that we're looking at and evaluating on Kauai. The first and one method that's been going on the longest is shotgun culling the birds at the cornfields. So I mentioned that typically we see the birds in small flocks during the day, sort of dispersed throughout the island. The one exception is during corn season and at the cornfields. And again, these fields are many, many acres, they're massive areas. And we'll see flocks of a couple hundred parakeets swooping at once. So beginning in 2005, the USDA started implementing shotgun culling, and this is now also done with private companies. All of this is contracted privately by the corn companies. We know of at least 12,000 parakeets that have been removed using this method in the past 15 years. And so it's a little bit difficult to evaluate specific efficacy of this. There's a lot of reasons for that. But what we do know is it looks like a somewhat sustainable method and one that should probably be carried on into the future. So the question we got a lot when we were first starting this project is why not just shoot them at the roosts? They're like sitting ducks, right? There's thousands of them in one area and they're asleep. So roost culling is complicated for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that if roost sites are disturbed, the parakeets will abandon them. Right now, the roosts are in these really urban areas where the parakeets don't have much that we know of impact on native bird species. The native birds are largely restricted to the interior native forests. So the fear has been if the roosts are pushed out of the developed areas, they might move into these native areas and have a larger impact on native birds. Beyond that, the concern was how the public would respond. We didn't know how folks would feel about hunters out in parking lots in the middle of the night shooting beautiful birds. So to that point, COVID-19 provided an unprecedented opportunity to try out this strategy. Not only, obviously, as everyone in Hawaii knows, there was a massive decrease in the number of tourists, but Kauai also had a stay-at-home order for a few weeks. So that allowed the opportunity to try this out with relatively few folks out and about and potentially watching what's going on. So a roost culling effort was funded by the County of Kauai, and it was implemented by a private wildlife control company called Connie Wildlife Control. And these folks were kind enough to let my team partner with them and collect data and actually evaluate the efficacy of this strategy. So this was implemented over 30 nights from March 2020 till March of this year at 4 different roost sites. The company used air rifles, 22 caliber air rifles, and it was all conducted after dark. So again, when the birds were sleeping high up in the trees. Over this period of time, they were able to remove over 6,000 parakeets. And this is a huge chunk of the known population. Again, the known population before then was about 10,500. So it's a pretty massive reduction from that perspective. On average, they were able to remove 45 birds per shooter hour of effort. So typically at one night, they would usually have about 2 shooters working at a time. So on average, taking about 90 birds per hour. However, it is important to note that this decreased over time. And this is something that we see with a lot of management programs. It's easier for things to work more effectively when there's more animals and animals that aren't quite clued in yet what you're doing. As the population gets smaller and the animals get smarter, it's trickier to take them. Of the 4 roosts that were worked on, 3 of them fully abandoned and 1 partially abandoned. So what this tells us is that the parakeets appear to be sort of wising up. They're figuring out what's going on. They know to move quickly when this starts rather than hanging out at the same spot and just allowing themselves to be shot night after night. So what it's looking like is that in the future, roost culling can absolutely be used, but it's probably best used for roosts that are small enough that they can be fully removed in 1 to 2 nights. So the final strategy I want to talk about is chemical control. And there are a couple different strategies here. The first is toxicants, which is of course a nice word for poison. It is used regularly for other pest bird species and it's been very effective. There are not currently any that have been registered for rose-ring parakeets. So within the US, they have to be registered for specific species before they can be used. And I'm not aware of any that have actually been tested even in lab settings for rose-ring parakeets. The other option is a contraceptive. Specifically, one looks potentially promising called diazepam. It has been tested in the field with different invasive parakeet species, the monk parakeet, and found to be effective in reducing fertility within that species. It's also been tested with rose-ring parakeets in the lab setting. So it's not been tested with rose-ring parakeets in the wild, but it does seem promising because of the studies that have been done. The advantages of contraceptions are that the public often like them. They're considered humane. They're very publicly friendly. They can be delivered through treated feed. So the animals perceive this as a a positive experience, they're typically willing to come back over and over. And it only has to be implemented during the reproductive season, so you don't have to do it all year round. Disadvantages, at least in compared to culling, it likely will not lead to eradication, and it requires habituating birds to specific feeding stations. So one thing that's tricky about rose-ringed parakeets in Hawaii, as opposed to the rest of the world, is they don't come to bird feeders, and we don't know why. Typically, this is actually one of the things that folks complain about with this species. They're considered a pest because they raid bird feeders. On Kauai, they do not come to them. So my team tested out 3 different types of bird feeders to see if we could get the parakeets attracted to them and coming to them regularly. We didn't have any chemicals in the field. We were just using birdseed and whole peanuts. We tried a platform feeder, which is what you see on the left, as well as a couple different types of hopper feeders you see on the right. These were elevated 10 feet in the air. We had feeders out for a total of 24 weeks at 5 different sites, and we did not get a nibble. The parakeets never even landed on them. They were completely disinterested, even though they were regularly in all the study sites. We speculate this might be because there's so much food available on Kauai year round. There's corn or fruit. Something is always in fruit in Kauai. So we don't know if this can be used in the future. It doesn't look like it's something that can be used at this moment. It is worth trying this on Oahu probably, because we know the parakeets are coming to bird feeders there. So I do recommend a study checking this out, this technique there, and see if it could potentially be added to the toolbox there. So wrapping up here, we know the population is continually growing despite active removals. And we know that along with the population, the negative impacts continue. A sustained and coordinated management effort is going to be necessary. So it's going to have to be a collaborative effort between private and public entities and coordinated at the island level to try to tackle this problem. And likely an integrated plan is going to be necessary. There's no silver bullet to control this population. It's going to require multiple different strategies being implemented simultaneously to try to get a wrap on these guys and knock down this population. So I'm a little over, and so I'm not going to go over this, but this is a list of folks that have been absolutely instrumental to doing this work. And my email address is here at the bottom if anyone would like to shoot me any questions in the future.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. We are running about 5 minutes behind, but if anyone has a quick question, we can go a few minutes into the break. Okay, so I have one question. You mentioned parakeets with rings. What about those birds that do not have rings? Maybe an ID question there.
Maybe they're asking about different species. There are some other parrot species that are introduced in the other islands that I'm definitely not an expert on. And maybe you're asking about if you see parakeets that don't have rings. For this species, that means either that they're an adult female or they're a juvenile.
Okay. We do have one more question we'll quick do, but then I'll have to stop it after that. So Melissa says, has distribution modeling been done to see potential distribution across the islands?
Yes, I actually just did this for Kauai and Oahu. And my work is funded directly by USDA, so I'll be turning this into them. And we're working together to put together an island-wide recommendation of management. And my understanding is that'll be publicly available probably sometime next year.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jane. It's fascinating. Okay, next up, to continue our conversation on axis deer, we have Dr. Steve Hess, lead researcher at Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center's Hawaii Station at Hilo. He is here to present some extensive population research that has been conducted on axis deer in Maui County. This research was conducted while he was a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Janelle. Can you hear me?
I can hear you great, and I can see your presentation.
Okay. Like Janelle said, this is work that Seth Judge and I started when I worked at USGS, and Seth was at the Hawaii Cooperative Studies Unit at the University of Hawaii. And let's see here. Oops. There we go. So Kurt Mercader talked about this. The introductions throughout Hawaii, first was in Molokai and 1868. And those deer are known to have bovine tuberculosis that moves between feral pigs and cattle. There were deer introduced to Oahu before 1898, Lanai in 1920, and Lanai is a big hunting destination now. And then there were 14 individuals introduced in 1959 and 1960 to Maui, and Maui lifted all the hunting restrictions by the mid-90s there to cope with the overabundance of deer. And on Hawaii Island, the introduction was opposed by a coalition of ranchers and environmentalists in 1968, and they didn't get introduced then, but then there were 4 deer brought over in 2004 by helicopter. So there's always this possibility for inter-island transport, and depending on where the deer come from, they could bring certain diseases with them. There have been reported vehicle strikes on Maui. There were 20 in 2018 and 54 in 2019, and there's this frightening potential for aircraft strikes. So they're very much becoming a species of concern due to their overabundance. So what we did was our objectives were to do a retrospective analysis of the axis deer data from Maui, compiling the historic data from 1959 to 2016, and account for the variable number of removals each year. And we had to use a simple population model to do that because more sophisticated models unfortunately couldn't handle that variable number of removals. And we projected the population growth from a simple model. We also used vortex modeling. Vortex is a population viability analysis modeling. It's a matrix model. It's actually very sophisticated. And we looked at removal scenarios that would most effectively reduce the population, with the hypothesis that increasing the number of females removed, the proportion of females removed would reduce the population growth rate and provide for more efficient control strategies. Oh, and one other thing I would say is we use Vortex because it's freeware, anybody can get it. And our data are going to be published very soon. And so you can use our parameters or your own parameters if you don't agree with our parameters, and come out with your own answers to these problems. So just looking at the data such as they are, here's our anchor in 1959 and 1960. There are 14 individuals there, and Kramer had the best opportunity to observe them in 1968, and he reported that there were 85 to 90 animals. And that's a pretty alarming population growth rate there of over 28%. And then if you look down here, the total number of removals reported is 11,200 over that span of years. But there's probably a great deal of data missing, especially from the mid 1990s through the early 2000s there. And so we project that with simple population models, looking at percent annual growth ranging from about 16% to almost 20%. And I have to say, the higher number there seems kind of out of the range. It's sort of a runaway train at that point, and the removals aren't really doing anything to that population. What we're looking for is the end of this period of removals that kind of agrees with the estimate at the time. And so we can't pin it down. Just the nature of the data is not very great data there. And you can see again, so there's over 9,600 removals in the 2000 teens there. And that really helps us get the floor of minimum population growth there. One thing I'll say about we're just picking one value for that whole period of time, when in fact the population growth rate is probably changing every year. And there are probably periods of mass mortality or at least zero recruitment. And we don't have any data on that, and that would be really good to get. So we had to estimate 13 life history parameters for the for axis deer, and we tried to get them from Hawaii where we could, but there's actually not a lot of data there. Most important of which is their mating system is polygynous, so males are redundant, and people tell me this every day. And that means that, you know, if one male gets knocked out of the population, there's always another male ready to step in. When we're looking at the mean number of progeny, otherwise known as brood size, we're saying that half the females have 2 youngsters each year. Doesn't matter if those are twins or if they're separate birth events. Looking at mortality, we had to scale that back because the mortality estimates in the literature comes from places where there are tigers. And we know that the tiger predation is really not doing much to the population here. So we also looked at inbreeding depression, and the paradox of some invasive species in Hawaii is that they have a small number of founders. And in the case of axis deer, that small number of founders was drawn from a small number of founders. But we used kind of the overall parameters for mammals at large. And we started the population with a female bias of 3 to 2 based on Steve Anderson's dissertation in 2003. So we ran this model for 10 years with all those parameters. And we did harvest, no harvest at all. That's sort of our control. And starting at 10,000 animals quickly reaches carrying capacity at 3 years. 10% harvest doesn't really touch them. They keep growing. 20% harvest reduces them slightly. So this is all with the same proportion of females to males, so it's a 3 to 2. Then we started increasing the number of females in there to 30% with that 3 to 2 ratio. And then we increased it to 30% with the 4 females to 1 male ratio there. And so that pretty quickly knocks the population down there. So here it is graphically. You can see the upper line is no control at all. 10% harvest also goes up to carrying capacity. And interestingly, that 20% harvest actually increases for a while before it starts to come down. And there you can see we're taking a greater number of females out of the population, those 2 lower lines there. We did the sensitivity analysis. This just tells you what matters the most. And so the mean brood size, how many youngsters they have, that obviously matters the most, whether they're having twins or single offspring. And Graff and Nichols reported that the twinning was rare in axis deer from Molokai and Lanai, but nonetheless it can occur. And also really can't do much about the percent of males breeding, but this female mortality is one of the larger things that we can change out there. So our findings were the mean annual population growth rates range between about 16 to 20%. And, you know, if Kramer was right, they could have been higher than 28% before 1968. So reducing the axis deer population on Maui is going to require an annual removal of about 20 to 30%, and a great proportion of female removals would increase that population decline. So selective removals of males may not only be inefficient, but also counterproductive to population reduction goals. And this is no surprise because at Point Reyes, where they eradicated axis deer and fallow deer, they found the same thing, that taking out a greater proportion of females would reduce the population faster. And in Argentina, where they have a problem in and around a national park there, they're finding that the insufficient numbers of female removals is resulting in ineffective control of the population there. And other states have implemented these earn-a-buck programs for deer populations in, for example, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, with mixed success there. Earn-a-buck means that hunters are required to take one deer without antlers before they can take a deer with antlers there. So it also agrees with what we found on the Big Island in Kahuku, that the unregulated removals of mouflon resulted in a disproportionate take of males. And we could measure that proportion of females in the population increase every year as a result of that disproportionate take of males. So in an ideal world, we'd have better data. And the data that I would really like to have are these life history parameters of adult sex ratio and recruitment. And that's a simple observational study that someone who's a deer enthusiast could go out in the field and look at. Survival during normal years and during El Nino drought years would be really nice to have, but that requires a number of marked individuals and to have the climate cooperate with you as well. But also necropsies of females, so you could get the pregnancy by age class, the proportion of twinning, and the sex ratio at birth. And that's actually pretty easy to do. And we did this at Kahuku with the mouflon there, and we dissected 56 pregnant females, and we didn't find any evidence of twinning there. So we think that the probability of twinning is, for example, less than 1 in 56. And the next thing is this index removal method. So there have been abundance surveys done. They tend to be really costly and effort intensive, and it's not really necessary to do these costly surveys. You can use the removal data to help you estimate the abundance out there with this method, calibrating an index by using removal data. And so the way that works is typically somebody goes out and does a survey, and I'll use nice round numbers here to illustrate this. They see 60 animals, and then 50 of those are removed. And they do another survey and they think, oh, we should see 10 animals, but instead they see 30. Well, why is that? So say, for example, to illustrate this, true population is 100 animals. The detection probability is 60%, 0.6. So the first count you will get, by definition, 60 animals out there during the survey. And then if there are 50 removals, you get that, and you get that second count of 30 animals. You can use that second count over the number of removals to estimate the detection probability. 30 over 50 gives you your detection probability. And then you can easily calculate the abundance from that using the first count over the detection probability. So there are assumptions here that the population is geographically closed, and islands are ideal places to have geographically closed populations. And if there's demographic closure, we can at least deal with that. We can factor that in. And the surveys have the same detection probability. So one reason that surveys would not have the same detection probability if, for example, the removals are done from the air. So the way this method works best is obviously with large numbers, particularly with large numbers of removals, and to have those surveys spaced really close together, the first and second surveys. With that, I'd like to thank everybody that supported us during this study. And Janelle, maybe I have time for questions, I don't know.
Yeah, we can take a few questions. Thank you so much, Steve. You mentioned Ernebuck, and I'm originally from Wisconsin, and so that sends my hair on ends. That was probably one of the most very unpopular programs that the DNR ever did.
Great, great. Yeah, Pennsylvania said there's a paper there that said they had better results. They said it improved the sex ratio out there, whatever that means.
Well, it's definitely effective, but it just wasn't popular with hunters.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, any questions for Steve? Looking for hands right now. And nothing in the chat. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to move on now since we are running a bit behind. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. How do I stop video?
There should be a little red icon on top that says stop sharing. Perfect. Okay. Next up, we have Dr. Lindsay Young, who is going to cover new advancements in detecting seabirds using drones equipped with thermal imaging. Dr. Young is the Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation and has been dedicated to seabird conservation in Hawaii for nearly 20 years. She has been a regular speaker at this workshop for the past few years, so we welcome you back. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, thank you guys for having me. And please call me Lindsay. Dr. Young feels pretty formal. So are you able to see? That's okay. Are you guys able to see my screen?
I am, yeah.
Okay. So please feel free to jump in if you have questions or put them in the chat, and I'll try and answer them all at the end. So I'm going to be introducing some work that we've been doing at PRC in order to scale up wildlife surveys. I'll go into how this applies to areas around the airport as we get into it. So to give some background on how we got into this, several years ago, we did a gap analysis and seabird monitoring manual for the US Tropical Pacific on behalf of the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And this was a large exercise that took over a year, involving all of the managers of seabirds from any agency in this geographic area. So basically the entire Pacific. So within the jurisdiction of the US Fish and Wildlife Service are quite a few areas, and a lot of these places have runways on them as this relates to wildlife hazards. And so what we wanted to know was what species were people monitoring and what were the data they wanted to get out of them? And then to combine all of that into an easy to use monitoring manual. So if you were a biologist that was new to a site, what were the gaps in the location and the species that you were working on? And so the thing that came out of this in terms of monitoring goals across the board, what you can see is the number one thing people wanted to know for any species they're working on. This is not just seabirds, but just about anything, are population size and trend. So we want to know how many are in an area and are they increasing or decreasing? This is kind of the foundation for conservation biology, knowing what you're working with. And then the second most pressing thing that managers wanted to know was what were the distribution of the species they were working with. And so again, this applies across not just seabirds, but other taxa. And then third was breeding biology. And so it really got us thinking about how can we better monitor population size and trend across a wide variety of taxa, and how can we figure out where these things are nesting. So pictured here is a wedge-tailed shearwater at Kaiana Point. I'm assuming almost everyone here has seen one of these guys at some point. They're very common in the offshore islands. And the challenge we have with a really common species like a wedge-tailed shearwater, or wedgies as we call them, is that they're so numerous that they're actually hard to count because you can crush burrows, you can miss burrows. It's difficult to get at them. But what about the things that are more the focus of what we want to avoid, our endangered and listed species? These are often super difficult to find. So we don't have the problem of there's so many we can't count them. We have the problem of trying to figure out where these things are nesting in the first place. So this is a Newell shearwater, and Hawaiian petrels have very similar needs. These are our two listed seabird species, well, two of the three banded storm petrels. And as you can see, the habitat that they like to nest in, these really steep montane areas in Hawaii, and then their burrows, even if you can get up here, which is usually by helicopter only, burrows are super hard to find. This is what at the very bottom here. So it's kind of like going through Lord of the Rings on your hands and knees trying to get at these things. They're very difficult to find. And so we wanted to think of how can we simultaneously count things as well as find things. So to give you an idea of the current methods that are used, this is how we count super common seabird species. So we'll often delineate a colony area, in this case, kind of point. And so our colony boundaries are pretty straightforward, you know, the ocean on three sides and then the fence on another. And because they're so dense in this area, we use a plot-based design. So we have sampling points throughout the reserve. We count within 8 meters of those plots and then extrapolate out. And so in a 60-acre area, we've got between 6,000 and 8,000 burrows. This measurement is not totally precise. We obviously miss something, and we miss some birds. It's just an estimate. So about 3 years ago, groups started looking at using unoccupied aerial vehicles, UAVs or drones, in order to count burrow nesting seabirds. And they did this in really open areas where you can see the burrows themselves from what's called an RGB, or red, green, blue photograph, just a regular color image. And you can see the burrows here. They're relatively straightforward and easy to count. And so what this group found, and the publication is listed below, is when they're manually counting, they can cover about 0.5% of the colony area. That's because a lot of it's too rugged to get to, or they risk crushing burrows that are underground. With the UAV, they could cover 100% of the colony area, so quite a big difference. On top of that, on top of the exponential increase in the amount of area they covered, they use 68% fewer manpower hours, even when accounting for for image processing time. So a reduction in cost, an increase in coverage, and potentially increase in accuracy. And this is great for areas where you can easily see things, but what about stuff that is vegetated? So what we really wanted to know was, could we survey areas that have vegetation to count really densely nesting species such as the wedge-tailed shearwater? And could we also use this to locate colonies in the first place, such as Newell shearwater and Hawaiian petrel? And so our initial drone that we started using this with was on the left, a Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual. And this is often used in search and rescue and firefighting. That's the main application. And we did this in coordination with the state of Hawaii 2 years ago, and used their firefighting drone and just did a test flight at kind of like, yes, no, can you see birds? These drones are relatively inexpensive. They are straightforward to fly, and they take relatively nice thermal images. But one of the main limitations of these is that it's not a super high resolution thermal imaging camera on here. So you can see the birds, but it's not great. And the other thing is it doesn't take radiometric JPEGs. So what that actually means is that the photograph you're taking has a spectrum of colors on there. So basically the warmer colors indicate things that are warmer. You can set that palette on any given flight. It doesn't actually record the temperature data. So if you mixed up your drone settings and flew, say, a steel color palette, just grays and whites, you're not going to be able to compare that to someone that flew it in a different one because the temperature data wasn't stored. So there's a limitation on the analysis end. You basically have to pick these things out with the eye. So once we knew that, yes, it actually worked, we upgraded quite a bit to a DJI Matrice with the Zemuse camera. And the main difference of this, aside from the much higher resolution thermal camera, is it takes radiometric JPEGs. So it stores the thermal imaging data within there. The resolution matters quite a bit because higher resolutions mean you can fly higher and get a larger number of pixels per unit area. So the resolution really does make a difference. So the methods that we use to trial this is we flew 30 minutes prior to sunrise, and we did that because we wanted the maximum temperature difference between the ground and the birds. And this is when the ground has been coolest for the longest. Flying at night requires different sets of FAA approval. And I should back this up. All the pilots that flew this were FAA certified pilots. We went through a week-long training course. as well as getting permission from the State Department of Land and Natural Resources to fly at Kiana Point. This is usually a no-fly zone. So there's a bunch of permitting involved in all of this. So we flew 30 minutes prior to sunrise, and then we tested various variables. The camera resolution was one of them. Percent overlap of the photos, whether we could get away with 70% overlap or if we needed 90%. And part of this is your RGB, your color camera, has a much higher resolution than your thermal camera. And so when you're comparing orthomosaics, that is essentially the landscape photograph that's stitched together from all the photos you're taking, there can be some warping between the two. And this becomes important, as I'll talk about in a minute in the analysis. We also wanted to test the flight height. So the lower you fly, the larger number of pixels you get per target, which is good for an analysis end, but no bueno for battery. So if you're flying at 8 meters, you're going to burn out your battery pretty quickly and fly a smaller area. So you're not going to be able to capture that entire area, which means you might have to do your flight over multiple days if you only have that 30-minute window before sunrise. So if you can fly higher, you cover a larger area in the landscape. So this is what we've been working with over essentially the last year. So this is what it looks like when you're actually flying. So we use what's called a lawnmower pattern. We pre-program the flight of the area we want to do. This is it on the left. So it shows you essentially the transects that are being flown. This little box over here on the right, that's the drone point of view. So you can see relative to the surrounding where you are at any given time. We always have at least 2 people, the pilot and then an observer, to make sure we're not going to crash into anything. And then the data component. So it's capturing both RGB, which is what you see here, as well as thermal imaging, which you see here, at the same time. And so this is really helpful to be able to see in real time if there's variations from what you're expecting. So if a mammal runs through the photo, which happened at Kiana Point, it was actually, normally that would be super disappointing. I'd run after the thing and try and get it out of there. But seeing a mongoose go through our imaging was actually great because we could test birds versus mammals in there. So this is what it looks like when you're flying. There's a lot of variables to keep track of. So our results, what we did was pre-marked about 1,000, just over 1,000 burrows, and then flew the next day. Our markings were either white pieces of coral, which you can see here in the left-hand photograph, or bright orange flagging. And then we flew and collected the thermal imaging. And so what you can actually see is this is the same area taken with both a thermal camera as well as an RGB, that these burrows show up really, really well. You don't actually see any of the birds in the color photograph because they're all underground, but their heat signature is really quite visible. And the one thing I want to point out here is some of these birds are relatively far underground, but their thermal signature is appearing at the burrow mouth. And so we're not detecting the bird itself, we're detecting the heat that's venting out of the burrow. And as we were doing this, we found that there were birds on the ground as we flew. There was the occasional adult that was still left, but they did not show up well in the camera. And this is because birds have feathers that insulate them very well against the heat. And especially for tropical seabirds, the point of that is to keep their temperature down. And so the burrow nesting component, that behavioral component, is actually really important for capturing the thermal signature. Even when we saw fledgling albatross in some of these photographs, they didn't show up as well as the burrow itself. So it detects the island heat signature of birds in the burrows, but not so much the birds themselves. So what we're currently doing right now is training an artificial intelligence model to be able to say, yes, this hotspot here is a bird because this has a temperature of 26.8 degrees Celsius. And no, this other red thing that's close in color is not because it's a different size. This is vegetation. So we're training a model to be able to detect these things. And what we want to be able to do is fly an area like Kiana Point and have it count all of that for us. And then also go into the mountains and actually fly and say, are these hotspots birds? Are these nesting seabirds? So the thing that I want to spend a little bit of time on is looking at the difference between mammals and birds. So birds have an internal body temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit and mammals are about 98. So birds are quite a bit warmer, but as I talked about earlier, their feathers actually insulate them. So this is a photograph taken with the kind of basic drone model, the Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual. And this is my backyard menagerie. So we've got a very pissed off cat who has been put in the guinea pig cage. We've got the guinea pigs who are wondering why they're in the cat cage or not in the cage, and the cat is. And we've got our mouse Ubi in the cage there, and then the chickens. So for context of what you're looking at, you can see that the mammals show up as white hot in there. They're quite easy to see. Even the mouse who is in a black cage that is relatively warm, you can pick out. The chickens, they're relatively visible, but not so much. And it's easier to see on this one here. But this one, our white chicken, Sprinkles is her name, she has the largest comb out of all of them. And it's the comb and the kind of non-feathered parts that really show up. So in short, mammals are much more visible than birds on this. So the applications, I think, for detecting listed seabird species are going to be large. We're still a ways off from working out how to get into the mountains on a pre-programmed flight rather than just flying manually, because it doesn't account for essentially vertical changes in topography. But for Department of Transportation, when you're doing mitigation efforts and having to find mule shearwaters and Hawaiian petrels in order to offset take, this is going to be an important tool for locating areas to work in montane environments. And then conversely, by doing predator control activities at the airport themselves, you can use these drones to actually survey for cats in a predator control scenario for offset for an HCP, for example. In field scenarios where you're looking at monitoring invasive mammals, I think this is where the potential is the largest. So using this to monitor trap lines, there's a lot of cat and mammal trapping that goes on statewide. And in areas where those traps might be under dense vegetation and there's not, say, transmitting cameras to let you know if there's an animal in there, flying your drone along the line and being able to tell from the thermal image whether something's in there, provided it's a non-lethal trap, will be huge. Using this to detect cats or mammals in an area where they're not supposed to be in. So say you've ungulate fenced something, you want to know if there's ungulates still left, or you have a predator exclusion fence, have you gotten all the cats out? That's going to be an important use. So for confirmation of eradication. And then finally, bait application, Island Conservation did an aerial broadcast using drones a couple of years ago, so there's potential there. And then hunting of ungulates, this photograph kind of cracks me up. These guys use thermal imaging drones not only to locate pigs in Texas, but use the drone to actually drive the pigs towards the shooter so that they didn't have to get out of their truck. So the benefits, so back to seabirds, it's safer than helicopters for montane surveys. The fewer people we get in helicopters, less time we spend up there, the better. It's potentially more accurate than manual counting for areas where we have really dense nesting birds, and it just can reach areas that people cannot. That initial study I showed has a really nice example of it. And it also can locate colonies and potentially conduct surveys without disturbing habitat. This is really important in montane areas of Hawaii where we might be searching for mule shearwater and Hawaiian petrel, and our very presence leads the predators in that are causing the decline in the first place. So if we can avoid putting actual trails in there for cats and mongoose and rats, it's important. It requires less manpower. So limitations right now, you are not allowed to fly drones on any federal property that have Chinese components. So it's the majority of drones. So there's sort of federal airspace restriction. There's also general airspace restrictions. So you have to always know where you're flying if you're allowed to be there. For burrow nesters, it does not give the total number of burrows, but rather the number of occupied burrows. Relatively data intensive, and there's potential for disturbance. So in Hawaii, a lot of the species we work with don't have aerial predators, the seabird species, and so they're not bothered by this. But this is the first thing that we test. But terns and other species that do have aerial predators, there is disturbance. Sorry, my daughter's getting a snack over there. Currently, we're not able to distinguish between species. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to distinguish between those. So with that, I'd like to thank our funding sources and DLNR DOFA for training and logistical support, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. I don't see any typed in yet, but I do see someone with their hand up. So I'm going to hit allow to talk to, it looks like Dalen. Dalen, you can ask your question by unmuting yourself.
I apologize. That was an accident. I didn't mean to read it. Sorry.
That's okay. We know it works. Okay, that was fascinating, Lindsay, especially when you showed the difference between the mammals and the birds. So that was really helpful. All right, we have one question coming through the chat. And it's, do you know if anyone's used drones on deer, from Kathy?
Yes, there are examples of using drones to survey for deer, and the Wildlife Society has a whole drone symposium at their conference in November. So I'd recommend signing up for that and checking out the speaker list there because there is more of a wildlife component. But in short, yes, there is a lot of work that's going on, specifically on the mainland, of trying to survey large ungulates and other large mammals using this technique. And Trevor, I see the question for list of approved drones without Chinese components. I only know of one. I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you shoot me an email, I can give you the model number of what that is.
Okay, we have a kind of a question comment from Roy about Friday night school football on Maui, and I'm guessing you're talking about the lights and how that can affect seabirds. That's a question I can't answer. I don't know if Lindsay, you have any comment on it.
Yeah, I mean, artificial lights affect our listed seabirds, and they're definitely attracted to them. In terms of what actions are going to be taken, I can't comment on that. I'm not a regulatory agency. We just collect the data for folks to help recover those species. So I think I would defer that to DLNR or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Great, thank you. And I know Trevor's questions about the Chinese components is due to new federal laws where we can't use equipment with Chinese components. So if anyone's curious as to why that question was asked. Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands or questions in the chat. Lindsay, thank you so much. That was fascinating.
My pleasure, thank you all.
Okay, now we are a little bit over our break time, but we will have about a 13-minute break. So we're scheduled to come back at 10:20, and we will have Gregory Spencer speaking from H.T. Harvey and Associates. We're going to be starting back in 1 minute. Okay, everybody, so it's 10:20, and we're going to start back with our presentations. Next, we have Gregory Spencer, a wildlife ecologist with H.T. Harvey and Associates. He specializes in strategies for the recovery of endangered species and has worked with HDOT to create the Kauai Seabird Habitat Conservation Plan. Today, he's going to discuss the first-year implementation of this plan at HDOT facilities on Kauai. Welcome, Greg. Please turn on your camera and I can help you share your screen.
Thanks, Janelle. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just getting everything teed up here. Everybody see that okay?
I can see it, yep.
Am I full screened or?
You can still not full screen yet. There we go.
Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm gonna talk today about the Kauai Seabird Habitat Conservation Plan and how it's being implemented at HDOT facilities on Kauai. I'm not going to talk about the HCP process, the regulatory side, or the permitting procedures. Ella covered that really well earlier, and I appreciate that. But I'm going to talk more about sort of the nuts and bolts of how this plan is being implemented and the various components that go into the implementation process. So the Kauai Seabird Habitat Conservation Plan is a pretty new plan. It was approved in May of 2020. The incidental take permit was issued by the service in May of 2020, just after the approval process was completed. And the ITL was issued by DOFA in June of 2020. And year one implementation was started in the fall and was quite successful. And final reports were completed and submitted in early 2021. This is a single HCP with multiple participants. So it was one of the examples that Ella had pointed out earlier that's available to applicants. And so HDOT is one of the participants within the KSHCP. And there are multiple participants, and so it's kind of unique in that way. I want to point out that there is a prime contractor that happens to be Pacific Rim Conservation. They sort of consolidate the entity or participants' annual reports, and they compile that into a report that includes the results of each participant group's or each participant's implementation during the year. So they're responsible for sort of compiling and presenting to the agencies a final report at the end of the year. We're going to talk primarily about one of the 3 covered HDOT facilities on Kauai, that being Lihue Airport. But I want to point out that Wili Wili Harbor and Port Allen Harbor are also covered facilities under the KSHCP. But we'll primarily be talking about the work that's being done at the airport. This is a picture of Lihue Airport on a nice day. I have a quick question for you, Janelle. Is there a way for me to minimize this bar at the top?
Well, we can't see it.
You can't see it.
So, but if
Okay.
you have multiple screens, you can drag it off of your screen if you want.
Okay. So these are the primary implementation items. Includes the action itself, the date, approximate date that these actions start and end, and then a summary sort of of what they are. Facility readiness assessment is something that's done early on, generally in August, prior to the seabird fallout season getting started. Ensures that minimization measures are in place before fallout begins. Training and outreach is a really big component of the KSHCP and all HCPs really. That gets underway prior to the beginning of the seabird season, but not too far in advance, so that the training is fresh in the minds of people who are going to be active at the facility. And that includes, it includes seabird awareness, general seabird awareness, information on the fallout phenomena, and then procedures for response and reporting and things like that. And outreach, quite a bit of outreach that extends and continues throughout the season, all the way up to the end of the seabird fallout season in December. That just it's just designed to extend the training and provide refresher information for people on the ground, and to provide valuable information and guidance to all participants at each facility. And then monitoring seabird fallout begins September 15th and goes through each day of the fallout season until December 15th, which is officially the end of the seabird fallout season in Hawaii. And this is conducted twice a day, once in the evening and once pre-dawn, a complete search of each facility. Predator control, as was pointed out earlier, is a big component of the KSHCP, and gets underway earlier, prior to the beginning of the fallout season itself, so that some effort can be made to reduce the presence and abundance of potential predators at the facility. And I'll talk a little bit more about this and some of the roles and parties that are involved in implementing that at Lihue Airport. The Seabird Conservation Program that addresses unavoidable impacts of the program, the mitigation work is being done at the Kahuama'a Seabird Preserve And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. That program was started in 2020, and it's a comprehensive program that will continue for the life of the ITL and the ITP. And then there's a reporting component as well. So there's a couple of different elements to reporting. It includes reports that are produced and to document and report seabird incidents that occur. And then also the annual reporting process at the end of the season. The seabirds that are covered seabirds include the Newell shearwater, which is federally and listed as threatened, state listed as threatened as well. The Hawaiian petrel, or wa'u, is endangered. The bandrum storm petrel, or ake, is listed as endangered as well. And another species, which is not state or federally listed as threatened or endangered, but which is covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the state of Hawaii as a protected species, is the wedge-tail shearwater. It's a pretty abundant species, and annually it does turn up in the fallout record, but it's not covered under the KSHCP. So for the facility readiness assessment is essentially a nighttime walkthrough inspection. It may be conducted on more than one night, depending on the size of the facility and the number of features that need to be looked at carefully. But generally, it has to do with nighttime lighting, facility lighting. And it's an opportunity to come through and evaluate the lighting, determine if there are any specific point sources or light features that appear to represent, a potential elevated seabird light attraction risk. It's basically getting in there, identifying things that might be a concern, working with the facility managers to identify potential opportunities to reduce that risk further. And then it's also, after recommendations are presented and measures are taken to either turn off lights altogether or reduce their brightness or implement some other minimization measure, then monitoring throughout the season can help to evaluate the efficacy of those measures. And that's going to be coming up pretty soon. We're going to be conducting that over on Kauai. So this facility readiness assessment really basically boils down to, prior to fledging season, are we ready for the seabird fallout season? And so it gives us an opportunity before fledging season starts to make any adjustments that are necessary to meet those minimization targets. And this is just a picture from Lihue Airport showing the new high mast LEDs with full cutoff shielding. You can see at nighttime, the shielding really does help direct the light down, and it more than likely has helped to facilitate minimizing light attraction risk further. Training and outreach. So each year prior to the seabird fallout season, each component group active at any of the covered facilities are scheduled for training exercise that covers the light attraction fallout issue itself, and handling incidents when they occur, rescuing seabirds, and proper reporting procedures. These trainings are provided for all facility management staff, security, the search teams on the ground that conduct the monitoring, and as well as tenants. In the case of Lihue Airport, this would be an extension to the rental car facilities and any contractors that might be active during the season. It includes practical stepwise procedures for handling down seabirds when they're discovered, and all of the things that are required to ensure that the birds are handled safely and delivered to SOS, and that the reporting is done properly. Outreach, as I mentioned before, extends to all support personnel. We try and get as far as, describing or extending the training and outreach to the handlers in AOA with the different airlines, you know, and even posting signage at the airport so that people are aware of the potential for seabirds to be seen, and that includes the public. This is the seabird light attraction fact sheet that talks about that we produced in 2020 and we're revising for 2021. And it talks about each of the species that are potentially can be encountered in the fallout. Describes a little bit about their natural history and ecology. Has pictures that can be used to identify the different species, and also instructions for handling and rescuing down seabirds, the kind of information that needs to be collected, and also a list of contacts for promptly reporting incidents when they occur. This has been really useful. This is something that we've used for the last several years, and we revise it each year as new information becomes available to us, and we learn things along the way about what's effective. So this has been a great extension and outreach tool. And we usually laminate this form so that it can be, people can spill things on it or whatever. It's really durable, and it can be, we produce a lot of them, and we distribute a lot of them among personnel at each facility. So the 2021 training is going to be done as it was last year due to COVID, online using Zoom or Microsoft Teams. The training is developed and will be delivered to personnel from HDOT at the airport, which includes, you know, management level folks, airport superintendent, engineers, airport security, tenant managers like rental car agency folks, and importantly, the down seabird search personnel. So everybody's going to be receiving the training, and it's going to be tailored to each group a little bit. So we may have multiple training modules that we'll use, and there may be, in certain cases, especially with the search teams, there'll be multiple sort of stages in the training exercise. They'll be in person to the extent that we can, and also the online training. And the modules will be prepared and given to each of the groups, each of the participating groups, so that they can continue to use the modules for quick reference, and, you know, to stay on top of, you know, the procedures. And importantly, it also helps to facilitate this train the trainer capacity that we've been unfolding for the last couple of years, which is basically giving site managers the knowledge and resources that they need to deliver the training to new staff that join the team during the season. So we present the training up front so that it's fresh for everybody before the season gets underway. And then managers have the capacity to deliver those training modules to new staff. And that's a really effective tool. Monitoring seabird fallout, that occurs between September 15th and December 15th. That is the period that's been determined as the official seabird fallout season in Hawaii. Trained monitors conduct searches of the covered facilities to rescue and document down seabirds. That's what's happening. That's a day in and day out, twice a day exercise that's intended to find birds that are downed, rescue them successfully, and you know, facilitate or, you know, increase the probability of survival. And also to document that take levels are remaining within those that are permitted. So if take levels exceed permitted expectations, some adaptive management provisions could be triggered there. So it's really a way of monitoring and documenting that we're staying within the range. So it's a really important part of the program. As I said before, it's twice nightly. occurs in the evening, 3 to 4 hours after sundown, to catch the initial phase of fallout. And then again, about an hour before dawn, to identify any birds that may have been missed in the first search effort, or birds that fell out later in the night after the first search had been conducted. It's done before daybreak because once the sun rises, birds that are down and exposed to the environment may look for places to hide and be much more difficult to locate. They'd be much more at risk of predation, or encountering a vehicle or something like that. These monitors gather information and document the incidents themselves when seabirds are found, participate in and are responsible for agency and SOS notification, and prepare and submit incident reports for each downed seabird that is documented. Record and report all observations of free-roaming cats or other predators of seabirds. And this is real important because this greatly helps to facilitate the control of seabird predators, even outside of the restricted portions of the airport. So H.T. Harvey biologists, for example, cover the public area of Lihue Airport, and they conduct surveys there, again, as I mentioned, twice a day in the same protocol. But when they observe predators like cats, they note how many, where they were, when, and that information gets reported to Wildlife Services promptly within the same day, so that actions can be taken in the public area. So the searches are conducted in two separate areas at Lihue Airport. One of them, the larger airside portion of the airport where active aviation activities are going on, is referred to as the AOA. And that's a restricted area. And that area is surveilled by Wildlife Services within the context of the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan. And then H.T. Harvey trained biologists conduct searches in the public area outside the main terminal, where active aircraft operations are not occurring. So it's a joint program. Essentially, we work closely with Wildlife Services throughout. Predator control program is, primarily focused on free-roaming cats, dogs, and other animals that might present a risk to downed seabirds. To protect them at the covered facilities before they're rescued, when they're vulnerable, the KSHCP does require an active predator control program during the fallout season. So we've been moving forward with that. Wildlife Services year-round conduct management and control of free-roaming animals for obvious, public safety reasons, and as a component of the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan at Lihue Airport. So to implement an effective predator control plan, we have to work very, very closely with USDA and take advantage of their the program that they implement the rest of the year, and then ramp up certain elements of it during the seabird season to really focus on protecting these birds, during the fallout season. So this is where the coordination between the search teams and Wildlife Services becomes really critical. So the prompt reporting of accurate information on the occurrence and location and circumstances associated with predator observations, particularly in the public area, is the procedures that we follow. And these are just a couple of images of these critters in typical pose. And with respect to the seabird conservation program at the Kahuama'a Preserve, I'll just talk a little bit about that. It's a really interesting program, again, aimed at mitigation for unavoidable impacts. The location of the project is up along the rim of Kalalau Valley, Kokee State Park on Kauai. And It entails the construction and maintenance of an approximately 5-acre terrestrial predator-proof nesting sanctuary for Newell Shearwater, so erection of a fence. And that, I understand, is just about finished now. That project, constructing that fence has been underway for several months and appears to be going really great. So pretty exciting. That includes eradication and control of predators within the fenced area, continued predator control, artificial nest construction, social attraction using the broadcast calls of seabirds, habitat maintenance, and monitoring, with the goal being to facilitate successful production of fledglings at a level that offsets or exceeds the impacts of take caused by covered activities. So this program is funded collectively by the participants, the multiple participant group within the KSHCP program. So everyone pitches in, and this program will probably continue for several years. Reporting, again, includes down seabird incidents. We call these incident reports. It's basically requires going to work and gathering information and documenting the circumstances associated with down seabirds that are observed. It has some specific requirements that include notifying DOFA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service by phone or email within 24 hours to let them know that an incident's been documented and that the reporting process is underway. And then the written report, which consists of the down wildlife incident documentation and reporting form, along with any additional information and documentation such as photos and other relevant information, needs to be submitted to both agencies within 3 days. And then the annual reporting component occurs after the season has concluded, after December 15th. The information is compiled and a report is produced for each facility. Then those reports are submitted to the prime contractor in, I guess it's in February, and then that report gets submitted to the agencies. Then that report gets reviewed and goes before the ESRC with recommendations, and then HDOT will meet with the ESRC to discuss the implementation success from the preceding season and to incorporate and receive recommendations for the subsequent season. So general kind of a summary in terms of how the 2021 implementation program will unfold. Facility readiness assessment gets started in August, maybe early September. It's finished up. Training and outreach gets started in early September and is wrapped up. The formal training itself gets wrapped up by September 15th, so that everyone's trained prior to the season getting started. And then outreach continues and is ongoing through the season. The monitoring program gets started September 15th and continues each day through December 15th. Predator control gets started no later probably than September 1st, and then runs right on through the season. And with respect to Lihue Airport, predator control continues year-round as part of the Wildlife Hazard Management Program plan, excuse me, but is just ramped up considerably during the seabird season. And that Kahu'ama'a Seabird Preserve, as far as I understand, the fence is almost complete and predator eradication is underway and continuing. Burrow installations are getting underway and has already started. And I think there's some expectations for meeting some certain installation targets by the end of the year, and then initiate social attraction and get started bringing birds into the preserve. And that's about what I've got. And I hope that I have time for a couple of questions. I'd love to respond to anything folks want to share.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, we have one question in the chat already, and you might have covered it after he asked it, but Patrick asked, what are the predator control efforts required by the HCP and how often are they carried out?
predator control goes on all the time, right? So it's pretty strategic, I guess, if you could say. I mean, in some respects, in that what we want to be able to achieve is rapid response capacity. So when animals are observed during the course of these systematic surveys that are conducted twice a day, that information is delivered as soon as possible to a point source, being wildlife services. In the case of Kauai, it would be the Kauai supervisor. And that information then gets distributed to people, to the wildlife services biologists, who can then deploy traps in the public area. So it's ongoing, and it's intended to be rapid response, so that we don't have big lags in terms of time when animals might be able to leave the area where they're observed. One of the things we see is we see some pretty consistent use patterns at the airport in the public area, where we see cats really kind of just being attracted to human activities a lot. So it's just tackling it as effectively as possible. I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question, Patrick.
Okay, and then we have a comment from Lindsay that the latest update on the mitigation fence is complete and the eradication is also complete. We will wait for several more months to fully verify no rodents, but as of right now, they appear to be out as of last week. So very good news.
That's great. Thanks,
and then
Lindsay.
a question from
Go ahead, Janelle.
And then a question from Melissa. Are there ongoing removal efforts or only in response to directly observing cats? It can be assumed cats are always present since there are large sources all around the airports. So ongoing removal is really important. And yeah, I'll let Greg speak to this, but yes, we do year-round removal.
Yeah. So that's a yes, that there's year-round removal, but we take it. I think what we've tried to do is we've tried to go beyond that and try and improve the capacity to know what is present at any given time, really. So we do 2 systematic surveys a day that enable us to kind of see what's there. I wouldn't assume that we see 100% of what's there all the time, but whatever's observed gets reported quickly to wildlife services, and they handle the actual responsive action.
Yes. All right. And yeah, we do have an extensive trap line that efforts are increased during fallout season. Okay. All right, we are running a little over time, so I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much, Greg. We're going to move on to the next speaker. Okay. Next, we have Che Patrick, who has worked extensively with the University of Hawaii and Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources on small mammal predator control. He has been involved in collaborative efforts to mitigate the impacts of domestic cats on wildlife and human health. Today, he's going to talk to us about policy strategies to address the real important issue we have here of feral cats. Welcome, Che. Please turn on your video and unmute yourself, and then you should be able to share your screen.
Hello. Hold on, there's a thing I have to do. Hold on. Give me a minute. I think I need to quit and reopen. Hold on.
Okay. We'll give Che a minute here. If anyone has any comments or questions while we're waiting. Connecting again.
Okay, I'm back. All right, hold on.
Great.
Let's see. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Chi, and this is my presentation called Bookum Dano, Addressing At-Large Cats with Policy in Hawaii. I'm the former small mammal control planner at the Research Corporation at the University of Hawaii and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources. This talk was made in context of a number of other talks regarding at-large cats and toxoplasmosis, but I'll quickly go over a little bit why cats pose a threat in Hawaii. As we heard from a number of our panelists earlier, they are a predator of concern, especially around airports, but also a lot of other public areas. They pose a significant threat through direct predation, of course, but also through their production of toxoplasmosis. Cats are unfortunately fortunately the only replicator of toxoplasmosis in Hawaii. And I mean, it requires rodents as an intermediary, but cats are required part of that life cycle of toxoplasmosis, which is a Toxoplasmosis gondii, which it affects native birds such as nene, alala, red-footed boobies, as well as others, and also a number of our native mammals, including the monk seals and spinner dolphins. Some of these are endangered, and some of them, as we'll probably hear later, are being downlisted, but nonetheless, these are species of concern that we want to protect, and by removing cats or reducing cats on the landscape, we can protect them. So there's going to be a number of acronyms. This is largely policy-based, so I'll go through a few of them. CC is County Code for Hawaii Island or Maui. DLNR, Department of Land and Natural Resources. HAR, Hawaii Administrative Rules. HDOA is the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. HRS is the Hawaii Revised Statutes. ROH is the Revised Ordinance of Honolulu. SB is the Senate Bill, and USC is the United States Code. So I'll be going through a number of ways that cats can be addressed with policy, both on the federal and state level, as well as the county level. So some definitions. Well, policy focus is usually on the vector, generally speaking, the disease and the predation. But so the question though is that vector being the cats. Are feral cats an invasive species? Well, the federal definition of an invasive species is an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Now, the state's definition is that it is harmful to the environment, economy, and or human health, and is not native to Hawaii. Now, the definitions are context dependent and based on harm. Therefore, pet cats, especially indoor cats, are not included. Now, legal designations of cats can be found throughout various state laws, including HAR, Hawaii Administrative Rules 429 under HDOA's rules regarding animals, and also predators under HRS 183, which is DLNR's rules. A domestic cat is defined under HR 471 as an exclusion from the term of non-domesticated animal. And Hawaii County defines stray cats as those wandering or running at large or found upon any public place or found not upon the lands of its owner. So, so there's a few designations of what cats are, but unfortunately, there are no definitions that we can find regarding what is a pet, despite the fact that pets are, that definition would be useful in our defining what cats go after. On the other hand, DLNR's definition of feral is there, but it is subjective, having escaped from being released from domestication and reverted to a wild state. So our current policy designations tend to refer to cats at the species level rather than whether it's a pet or it isn't. It doesn't matter where the cat happens to be or what kind of designation someone might give it. So who owns a cat? Now, there's actually a new law that just came on the books this year, and I'll talk more about that later, but it's under SB 1387. An owner is any person owning, harboring, or keeping a dog or cat providing care or sustenance for a dog or cat, or having custody of a dog or cat, whether temporary or permanent. And then I have to fix that a little bit, but the city and county of Honolulu also has an ordinance defining ownership. Any person owning, harboring, or keeping, providing care or sustenance for cats are very similar. Now, statewide regulations include penalties for animal abandonment, liability for approximate personal or property damage, and persons responsible for any animal in the state park are required to clean up after their droppings and may be liable for costs or capture of animal or restoration of any damages caused. That's only for state parks, though. In 2019, 2 administrative rules sections were added to the state boating lands, including one that prohibits feeding of wildlife, strays, or feral animals, and abandoning animals and creating or contributing to colonies. These new sections were added to respond to complaints about increasing feeding of feral animals on doe-bore facilities, which created a potentially unsafe and unsanitary condition. Also in 2019, the Hawaii Invasive Species Council passed a resolution 19.2, which supports keeping cats indoors, use of peer-reviewed science in pursuing the mitigation of impacts of feral cats, cat containment options, but it doesn't recommend the use of government-funded trap, neuter, return projects, largely because they're just not effective. So there are a number of county regulations that cover various aspects of the cat issue. City and County of Honolulu requires owners to sterilize cats older than 6 months and provide them with an ID collar tag or microchip. I'll talk about it a little later, but also now a microchip is required for both cats and dogs. So Maui County requires that all cats released for adoption to be neutered, and Hawaii County prohibits owners, which is undefined there, from taking cats to county beach parks or businesses where food is sold, and prohibits feces or other nuisances on any public area. So Hawaii County's rules are pretty stringent there. So federal regulations that earlier panelists have talked about, and I won't talk too much here, but the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act both prohibit the killing of these protected species, be they migratory birds or endangered species. Now, so speaking of the new laws that came on the books back in 2020, the Honolulu City Council added the requirement that all cats and dogs in Honolulu must be microchipped by owners. Prior to this, there was no such requirement for cats. And SB 1387, as I said, just this legislative session and through a veto override became Act 5 of the 2021 special session, is a similar law to the above. It requires microchipping for cats and dogs now statewide. Unfortunately, there was an exception for designated population management programs, which was added, leaving it open for interpretation if it covers owners of colony cats. So even though the people could be considered owners, they're not required by this law to microchip their cats. So it's problematic in that it leaves a gray area for those people maintaining colonies, because they could just, there's no definition of what a designated population management program is and who designates it. So people could just designate it themselves. In any case, there's some potential future directions. We've been working with folks in the conservation area, as well as people who are interested in animal welfare. Many of these things we can agree on, including statewide requirements for neutering, including new arrivals into the state, statewide definitions for what are pet cats, what are owners, although we just heard there's a new definition for owners, and what are feral cats. And then coordinating across the counties for standard definitions and neutering requirements would be great. So we also would like to have support for sanctuaries like the Lanai Cat Sanctuary as a potential alternative or tool for control. Granted, that's not the complete answer. Those would get filled up very quickly. Maybe possibly subsidies for catios and support for increasing adoption, including for those efforts adopting them out of Hawaii. We also we're looking towards prohibitions on feeding cats in certain public areas, and potentially going with the feral cat task forces model. There was a task force that was put together several years ago that worked with all the various parties, including animal rights folks, as well as government and conservation interests, to come up with this model, which hopefully would address the cat issues on Kauai, mapping sensitive habitat for threatened and endangered species, creating term limited management TNR outside of these areas. And then at the end of the term, all cats needed to be removed to private enclosures or taken to shelters. So we're hoping that that kind of model might work for various other efforts. So in any case, these are policy, these are good tools, but they need to be used. There are plenty of existing policies that, if enforced, could resolve many of our issues with at-large cats. One example that I give often is that the litter laws, even though they aren't intended for, or they don't specifically talk about wildlife per se, if they were enforced strictly, both the feeding of cats and allowing of cats to drop feces on various lands that don't belong to these owners, that could cause mounting fines and fees that could be prohibitive to those who are conducting illegal behaviors. So don't be afraid of opposition. The science is clear, the policies are clear, and the native wildlife will continue to decline if we do not enforce these policies. So it's important that we use the policies that we have, as well as consider new policies in the future. And that's my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now, or at the end of today. You can reach me at pt@hawaii.edu. And many thanks to my patient family, friends, and colleagues at Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources and the Toxoplasmosis and at-large technical working group. Mahalo.
Thank you, Patrick. We have one question coming in. So when you say neutering, are you saying that law you referred to is covering neutering and spaying, or just neutering of male cats?
I'm not sure what that's in regards to. Neutering or spaying or neutering. I mean, sterilizing animals in general, both male and female cats. But ultimately, removal of cats is ideal, not just neutering, because a lot of the trap, neuter, return, or trap, spay, return programs, they ultimately, various studies across the world have shown that these kinds of programs, although they feel good, they don't actually reduce the numbers of cats out on the landscape. So.
All right, that was from Christina. We have another question from R. Severn. So I think that's maybe the first initial and the last name, but he says, hi, Patrick, great presentation, thank you. Are there any programs or public policy plans to help people who like to feed stray cats? This activity is an annoyance at the community gardens in Honolulu. I think impactful on the team turn nesting, as well as unhealthy to people.
Oh, well, there aren't any current programs specifically regarding trying to help people who are feeding stray cats. We're trying to work. There are various policies in place that we could, in theory, if there were enough enforcement and or policing, could work with those kinds of people and try and get them to stop those kinds of efforts. The policies that could help us with those kinds of actions and change those behaviors are on the books. It's just a matter of us using them. So.
And as kind of a follow-up, Jessica asks, what are barriers to making it illegal to feed colonies and feral cats?
Well, largely it's a barrier of will for new policies to be made, but also the enforcement end. A lot of times, unfortunately, the cat carers are they can be problematic and challenging to work with. Nonetheless, we're as a person who had been working for the government, we've been trying to work with the animal rights folks and try to find a middle way that we can agree on. And a lot of it is actually trying to reduce the production of cats. So if there's more neutering and spaying, as well as trying to reduce the numbers of people or allowing people, reducing people from allowing their cats to go outdoors, that will significantly reduce the numbers of cats being let out onto the landscape. But nonetheless, there is various laws that we could enforce that would prevent illegal feeding of feral and colony cats.
So in a sense, through various ways, feeding feral colonies is already illegal. It's just not enforced.
Yes, in my opinion, there are already policies in place that we could use in order to go after folks who are doing this illegal feeding of colonies of cats. It's just that a lot of times the policing bodies, including the designated animal control groups like humane societies, et cetera, they are reticent to actually go after the very folks who are doing these illegal activities. So.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions, so we're going to move on to our next speaker. So next up, we have Luca Zavis. Luca is an outreach associate for the American Bird Conservancy, focusing on the Birds Not Mosquitoes project. This project is a strategy to save endangered forest birds from avian malaria using mosquito birth control. And while this may not directly impact airports, this is a really interesting project that is important to the larger conservation world within the state. and we can gain inspiration to solve our own challenges through this. So welcome, Luca. We're excited to have you. You can unmute and begin sharing.
Thank you, Janelle. And thank you everybody for having me. Let's see, can you see the slide?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so aloha mai kako o Luca's office ko uinoa. Hello everyone, my name is Luca and mahalo nui loa to the Hawaii Department of Transportation for opening space for birds not mosquitoes to share with you the plight of our manunahele, or our forest birds. So I'd like to set the stage and ask everybody, if it's safe, please close your eyes and listen. And take in a deep breath, and as you exhale, you hear a chorus of voices, our endemic native forest birds. Their songs filling the forests of Hawaii, Mauka to Makai. And once upon a time, these songs were heard across the Hawaiian chain. But now, many of their voices have gone silent. There were once 59 different honeycreeper species, of which only 17 survived. And just recently, in 2004, we had to say goodbye to the po'o'ui. And so I have an activity for everybody to do. So if you go to the top of your screen, there will be a drop down that says View Options. And if you click on that, you should see a selection called Annotate. And once you click on the annotate, please take a stamp tool and take it and indicate of which of these species have you seen with your own two eyes, not through a screen, but like actually seen them out and about. And let me know if people are having problems. Oh, yay. Okay, I can see it's on the other screen. Awesome. I'll give it a couple more seconds. So, as we see, the birds that are more readily available to across the Hawaiian chain, like the EEV, are found on most of the Hawaiian Islands, the Apapanetu and Elepaio. We have Amakihi. These I was assuming was going to be the ones that are well known and well seen. Oh, Kepa has one. But for the Akikiki, Akeke'e, Akohekohe, and Kiwikiu, let me use my actual pen here. There we go. The Akikii, Akeke'e, Akohekohe, and Kiwikiu. I am not surprised that many of you have not been able to see them. And this is because of their populations have significantly decreased in the past couple of years. And I just wanted to highlight this, the Akikiki and Akeke'e are found on Kauai, while the Akohekohe and Kiwikiu are on Maui. And the Akohekohe, it has a population estimate about 1,768, and the Kiwikiu is 157. And both of these species in the most recent population estimate and habitat range estimates of 2018 was found that for the Akohekohe, its habitat had a constriction of 61%, and the Kiwikiu also had a constriction of 41%. And this is saying that where they were found when they were doing point count surveys was not in the entire Waikamoe Preserve, which is on Haleakala, Maui, but they had become a lot smaller. And because of this, in 2019, there was this effort to translocate Kiwikiu from Waikamoe to just on the other side of Haleakala to the Nakula Preserve. But it was found initially that we thought that this translocation had completely failed because the Kiwikiu had died because of avian malaria. And just in July of 2021, we got some really great news that male one, the one bird, had survived. And this just gives hope that this restoration effort in Nakula actually was able to support Kiwikiu. And the main limiting factor of why they weren't able to continue living there was because of avian malaria and the presence of mosquitoes. And so hopping over to Kauai, we're going to look at the Akeke and Akikiki, and its population's estimates around 945 and also 468. And both of these birds are also showing this habitat contraction. Population estimates in 2000 noted that there were some species down in the lower, some individuals down in the lower elevations. But in the most recent survey done in 2018, for both of these species, zero could be found in the lower elevations, and they were only being found up in the high in the Alakai Plateau, right there at the top. And this contraction and this reduction in their population is really just indicative. And what we're hearing from the field crews is that there's being less and less birds being seen and heard. And this is just really driving home that if something isn't done, within the next 10 years, many of these species will go extinct. Oh, let me, I forgot to do this. Clear all drawings. There you go. Okay, I would like to go for it. So what are these threats to their survival? And so again, I would like everybody to use that stamp tool and just indicate what do you think are the 2 top risks to our native forest birds. And we have here non-native mammalian predators, feral ungulates, the effects of climate change, habitat loss, both by urbanization, farming, logging, invasive species, and then also avian diseases. And thank you, those who have. And as you noted, yes, avian disease is the #1, but it is being compounded by the effects of climate change and also the fact that it was already the habitat that they have is limited and the effects of just predators. So it's not just one thing, it's all of these different factors working together. And as we indicated, yes, avian disease is the #1. And the vector, let me clear this again. The vector for this is Culex quinquefasciatus, also known as the southern house mosquito. It arrived in Hawaii in 1826 upon the HMS Wellington. It is one of 6 biting mosquitoes found here in Hawaii. It bites at night. It prefers to bite birds, and it is found within a tropical range, meaning that its distribution is limited by temperature. And this mosquito is the vector for avian malaria or Plasmodium reticulum. Plasmodium arrived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, most likely with the introduced songbirds from the Americas, South America, and Asia. After Plasmodium travels from mosquitoes into the host bird, it asexually reproduces in the red blood cells, which causes these cells to burst open. And this causes the symptoms of anemia, weakness, depression, and loss of appetite. So essentially, our birds are just dying from just being sad and not having enough energy to continue. And so for the longest time, our birds were finding refuge in these higher elevation areas, and the mosquitoes were being because of that tropical range constriction on mosquitoes, they were being here down under 4,500 feet elevation. But because of climate change, the mosquito line is fluctuating and extending higher into the refugia with every warm night. And places like the Alakai, there's no more space for these birds to continue moving up. So and we're already seeing mosquitoes in the Alakai Plateau. And so, especially for the birds on Kauai, there's nowhere else for them to go. There's nowhere else to run away to. And our birds are important to Hawaii because of the pilina that they have both with the environment and with the people here. They have this bioculture relationship. And these, they have co-involved with some of the unique plants here in Hawaii and are thus integral for the pollination and dispersal, such as some lobeliads. And they're also, their importance to Hawaiian culture, they had filled utilitarian needs through their use of their feathers to create ahu'ula, mahiole, kahili, head ornaments, and lehulu. And these physical creations were woven into the bird's connection between ao and po, or the light and the dark, the seen and unseen. And their connections and their ability, their connections with nature was also connected in, captured in mele, in ka'au, or legends, and olelo no ia, or proverbs and sayings. And as ho'ailona, as omens, and kinolau and aumakua. So all of these really helped people here, Native Hawaiians here, to be able to have a way to talk with and to see how their natural environment was reacting to different changes, both to temperature, people, and through just to be able to be a ho'ailona, an omen or a signal of the health of the forest, the health of what was going on. And so what can we do to save these species? What can we do to save them from avian malaria? And this was a question that brought together many multi-agency, and a partnership was formed to create Birds Not Mosquitoes. And the tool that was identified that could be best used to help save our forest birds was Wolbachia. And Wolbachia is a microscopic bacterium. It is naturally occurring intracellular bacterium found in the tissues of insects around the world and here in Hawaii. Birds Not Mosquitoes has nicknamed Wolbachia as our mosquito birth control because it has been found that if mosquitoes with 2 different Wolbachia strains mate, their eggs will not be viable, meaning that these eggs do not hatch. And to help conceptualize this, I'm going to take you guys on a visual journey. Here we are in Hawaii, and these are mosquitoes naturally found here, or that are already found here. And they have the wild type Wolbachia with them. And so they're indicated in red. We caught some and shipped them off to laboratories in Kentucky and Michigan and determined the strain of Wolbachia that they had. Then they put them in, treated them with antibiotic to remove the wild type Wolbachia, and then transinfected it with a different strain of Wolbachia. And after some testings to make sure everything was okay and that they were healthy, we will be shipping them back to Hawaii and reintroducing them into the wild. And we will be essentially flooding the system. So increasing the probability that this yellow mosquito here, which is a female, will have a greater chance of mating with one of our blue transinfected mosquitoes versus a red wild type mosquito. And so that they will have non-viable eggs. So there are some inherent risks. And one of them is insufficient resources, climate change outpaces development, female release, and increased adaptability. So insufficient resources is more on our end as things that Birds Not Mosquitoes partnership can control. So where are we deploying? Do we have enough funding to be able to do a landscape scale release? Is our models correct? Where we're modeling of where mosquitoes are, where they are reproducing, and where are we going to deploy them? Just making sure all of those hogs match up. And then another one is climate change. The mosquitoes just move too quickly. There's too many of them. We aren't able to, even though we release everything and we are following our models and everything, it just isn't able to keep up with the effects of climate change. Another one is that this is all based upon that we are releasing males, and male mosquitoes do not bite humans. And so I just want to highlight that there is no risk to people. But if we accidentally, or if a female is accidentally released, this could cause the whole system to revert back to where it was before we had the release of the males transinfected. And another one is increased adaptability. We are crossbreeding and back crossbreeding these mosquitoes to transfer the Wolbachia from our Hawaii wild type to change the Wolbachia. And through this, we could be introducing adaptabilities like more cold tolerance to mosquitoes here in Hawaii. So we are working to ensure that the mosquitoes that we bring back are not better adapted to climate change or better adapted to cold temperatures so that they do not go into the higher elevation forests that are still refuges on places such as Hawaii. And so we aren't the first to use this technique to control mosquito populations. Mosquito birth control has been used in locations indicated on the map for human diseases. And we are just adapting this tool to help our native birds in Hawaii. And so to be truly effective, the birth control needs to be released at a landscape scale. And some questions that we are addressing now are, where are we going to rear them? And then also then goes to, how are we going to transport them? Are we rearing them on the continent and then having them flown over to Hawaii as pupa, as larvae, as mosquitoes? Or are we able to rear them here at facilities on islands such as Lanai or Kauai or Oahu so that we can be able to quickly disperse them throughout the different islands? And also release, where are we going to release them? Is releasing them just in high elevations enough, or do we have to release them down here in the lower elevations? And to where are the mosquitoes being connected to? And so where are we now? And I just want to show a timeline. In 2020, we had a successful Wolbachia swap. Here in 2021, we had a small import permit approved by the Hawaii Department of Agriculture for just to test out our tool. Next up, we're doing cage trials, and we're hoping to do upscale to a landscape release in 2024. Also, with keeping in mind that we are working to expedite this process as much as possible while still following all the regulations and all the permitting requirements, because as I said, we don't think that many of our birds have until 2024 to be able to survive. And the main bit of this is not only just the science, but is the community. And I wanted to say thank you for the biosecurity for that the airport systems are doing into being able to control the influx of mosquitoes. For if we were able to reduce mosquitoes across the landscape, suppress them, we want to make sure that more aren't being transported here from different islands or different places. Also, we want to talk to the community of reducing habitat within and around their own homes. Funding is really important in creating insectarides and being able to continue this. This tool isn't a one-time thing. It is something that needs to be released over a long period of time to effectively suppress mosquito populations. And really to be able to connect with the community, to be a voice through education, through going to Kauai Forest Bird Project, the Maui Forest Bird Project, to see what kind of publications and science they're doing, and to support all the policies and our permitting that is going through. So through education, you can be a voice for the birds. And if you would like some more information, Birds Not Mosquitoes has launched their our Instagram, Facebook, social media presence, where we'll be sharing a lot of tidbits and small, easily shareable notes and information about our birds and about our tool so that you can share it with your family, with your friends, and so that you could get to know it too. Because we really want, like Coconut Wireless, for me to tell you, then you to tell 5 friends, and then tell 5 friends, so that in essence, over time, we'll be able to have a large community group voice to be telling our legislatures and our people of power that our birds are important and we want to save them. And so I just want to leave you with a video of the apapane. And really, this is just a dream so that my son, his children, and their friends and families will be able to chance to listen to these voices and see these birds, not just learn about them from our stories or our past, but also to see them for them with their own eyes. And thank you, everybody. And I'm going to stop share so I can see the chat. I think I went a little over time.
That's okay. You started a little late too. We're running behind, but I think we'll be okay to take some questions. So that was really interesting, Luca. Again, if someone has questions, you can type into the chat or use the Q&A or raise your hand and I can let you speak. Gregory Spencer says, wonderful presentation, Luca.
Oh, thank you.
I agree. And I really like the ability to interact, even though not everyone could find the annotate tool. It looks like several people did. And so that was pretty neat.
Okay. Well, as always, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luca. Okay, we'll move on to our final presenter for the day. Ray McGuire is going to finish the day, and this is going to be our first theme highlight presentation. So Ray is a wildlife biologist for the Division of Forestry and Wildlife on Hawaii Island. He has been working to help manage our state bird, the Hawaiian goose or nene, which was recently downlisted from federally endangered to federally threatened and is still endangered at the state level. Today, he's going to talk about the challenges and progress of recovering that population on Hawaii Island. So welcome, Ray. You can turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Let's see. Share. Sorry. Oh.
All right, I'm seeing it.
Okay. Aloha, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am Raymond McGuire. I'm the wildlife biologist for DLNR DOFA on East Hawaii, and I will share some information on how we're doing with recovering the nene population. So I wanted to start off by giving a brief history of the decline and recovery of the nene over the years. Way back in the 1800s, there were an estimated 25,000 nene, across the entire state or island system. But as people came to visit, Westerners came, the nene became a type of food source for whalers and other people in ships because they could, preserve the meat, salted meat, and it was one of the contributing factors to the decline. And as early as the 1900s, the population dramatically declined to the point where people, really noticed that there weren't that many nene anymore. People like Herbert Shipman, he decided that he wanted to captive breed them. So he kept a few nene and he bred them through his program. Bunch of zoos, even Slimbridge in England, received some nene, and there are tons of, or I guess not tons, but there are a handful of private breeders that also had nene. But by the 1950s, there were only an estimated 30 nene left in the wild, and all of the 30 nene were on the Big Island. 1967, nene were listed as endangered species. But through the captive rearing program from 1960 to 2008, approximately 2,800 nene were released on the main on Maui, Hawaii, Kauai, and Molokai. Oahu didn't get any birds. So this picture here is pretty interesting. Somebody sent me this. It came from a book. But it shows these Paniolo. They, the caption says that they went hunting for wild turkeys. And if you notice in the background here, these are not turkeys. They're nene. So, there are captive rearing programs, a bunch of releases of nene. And eventually, things got a lot better for nene. I'm totally glossing over a lot. It was a huge program to get this far. In 2008, there were lots of nene. From that original 30 in the 1950s, in 2008, there were 2,000, half of which were found on Kauai. And why Kauai? Is believed that the lowland habitat, the warmer areas, open grassy areas, and the fact that there's no mongooses on Kauai really helped create great habitat for the nene. So much so, they tend to like these open grassy areas such as golf courses. This golf course in particular, Kauai Lagoons, is right between two runways of the Lihue Airport. And that posed a problem. In 2009, we had that incident, Miracle on the Hudson, where Canada geese struck the plane and they had to make an emergency landing. Luckily, no people died, but we didn't want that to happen. And of course, with such a high density population in nene down here in the golf courses, it became more and more of a possibility. So I found this cartoon. It's look up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane. Oh no. And obviously feathers falling from the sky. A big part of the recent downlisting of the nene and the increase of the nene population, especially on the Big Island, had to do with what happened next. The governor, Abercrombie, signed a proclamation in 2011 to translocate a bunch of the birds from that golf course in Lihue, from Kauai, and bring them to Hawaii and Maui Nui. So Hawaii Island received almost 600 nene from Kauai during those 5 years of translocation. And that more than doubled the existing population on our island. So one of the things that we needed to do was develop habitat. When we bring the nene here, where we're going to house them, we wanted to find an area that's suitable habitat for the birds, so they like ranch lands, open grassy areas. This area in particular, so here's a star. This is where the nene pens are, kind of in the saddle of Mauna Kea, Mauna Loa. And we created this 44-acre habitat originally. It's away from, Hilo or Kona, our biggest cities, and of course runways. And it's also nicely situated within the nene's natural flyways. So this white line here denotes the flyway of the local nene. So this is the original 44 acres that we created during the proclamation years, and this is an additional 54 acres we were able to create recently. We finally just finished the fencing for that area. So here's what our sanctuary looks like. Really open area down here. We have a little water feature. Again, this is old reclaimed pasture area. Once the lease came up on an old ranch area, it went back to DOFA, or went to DOFA, and we used this area for a Nene sanctuary. So the thing is with the Nene is, and how we select these areas is, they're different than the forest birds that people typically think about when they think of Hawaiian birds. Nene, again, they thrive in open areas. So, you know, we wanted a limited amount of native trees. And actually, you know, they do thrive on this kikuyu grass, which is also kind of strange or different than other native species. This is our predator-proof fence. So all of that 44 acres and now the 54 acres is covered by this, or the perimeter is this predator-proof fencing. It's hog wire, has the bones of it, and then there's the
Ray, sorry,
Yes.
Ray, can I interrupt you for a second? Would you mind,
Okay.
your audio's a little spotty. So would you turn off your video? I think that will help.
Okay, how do I turn that off?
So the bottom left, there's a toolbar. You see a microphone and a video. And if you just click on, okay, you're in present mode now, actually. So that won't work.
You want me to exit present?
Yeah, if you exit present, you should
No,
be
no,
able
you don't have to.
to.
You don't have to.
Oh,
I muted it for you. Go ahead. Keep talking. So you're muted. Your video is muted. Just keep talking.
okay, thank you. Is that better?
Sorry, thank you. It is, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is our predator-proof fencing. The PVC, our PVC coated chicken wire here. It's designed to keep out, you know, our predators, Nene predators, are ground nesters, so they are susceptible to things like dogs and pigs, cats, rats, mongooses. And then the bottom of our fence is buried about a foot. And then the top is also curved to prevent cats from jumping in. And so far it's been successful in keeping all of these predators out. So in the years that we've created the fencing and since the proclamation, we've been able to successfully fledge out to at least 217. There's been more we've missed. So we consider them fledged if we ban them in the area. And if we don't ban them, then we're not, we can't say that they were, you know, successfully fledged. But usually I would say over the past couple of years, we've missed maybe half of what actually comes out of the pens. So the numbers are actually higher than the 217. Our facility is, you know, we're still using it because it offers not just habitat for the Nene that came in during the proclamation, but also, you know, it's open top, so local birds can fly in. The birds that were translocated could fly out. We also use it as an area where we can bring in animals such as abandoned goslings. So just recently, or this past season, I picked up a gosling from the Kulani Correctional Facility. Apparently, it was abandoned by its parents. The gosling ended up walking into the guard shack And they called me one night. It was, getting kind of cold. It's high elevation up there, so it gets really cold. So I was able to get the gosling, and then the next morning I brought it up to the Nene pens, and the video of me releasing it, and these parents quickly came and rescued the gosling from me. So Nene have this really strong, like, parental instinct where they hear a gosling call, and they want, if they're parents, they will want to, go and protect the gosling. So our facility also helps with that, being able to, increase the population of Nene that way. Here's, so our primary control for, keeping this area a good nesting area for Nene is keeping predators out. The fence is the top, the most important layer, but we also do lots of trapping. We use live traps as well as good nature traps. We have, we get dogs, cats, and mongooses on the outside, pigs sometimes on the outside. Nothing has been captured on the inside. I also have camera traps within our sanctuary, and I haven't seen any of the larger predators. We do have rats and mice, but it's really hard to keep rats and mice out of anywhere. We also do evening surveys in the area for barn owls, especially during nesting season, because they can get into our fenced-in area. They can fly over it, and the best way we found is to just go out there and monitor. So far, we haven't seen any barn owls take any of the goslings, but there are barn owls in the area. So as an NA, one of the ways that we can keep track of the NA and try and figure out where they're moving, because right after the translocation of the birds from Kauai to the Big Island, we noticed that Nene were kind of popping up in other areas. And part of it is because, when the Nene were translocated, we kept them for a year within our holding pens, and then they flew out the following year. And they hooked up with a lot of our local birds. But I also think that the Nene were checking out just the island. They came to a new island they weren't familiar with. So they ended up in areas that they haven't seen before, and that people haven't seen the Nene in before, at least for the past 50 years. So some areas that they ended up flying to, which we hadn't seen before, or for a very long time. So these are maps of our translocated bird, or our transmitted birds. The map on the left, this Nene ended up flying out of our Nene pens, and he flew down towards Hilo, Lapuihoi, along the Hamakua coast, and he ended up north. And up here, before our translocation, there really hadn't been very much activity of birds, at least not for the past 50 years. It ended up returning to the Nene pens, where it's still hanging out. This bird in particular is pretty interesting because he's the offspring of two Nene that ended up flying to Oahu and successfully nested. And this bird was the only one that ended up surviving. So he came back to the Big Island. And because he was such an interesting bird, I wanted to put a transmitter on him and make sure that he doesn't fly back to Oahu. This second map is another bird that I picked up. I picked him up in Waikoloa. I think he had some parasites and he went to rehab. He was released back to us healthy. So I put a transmitter on him, and instead of flying back home, he ended up flying south. So he went down to the national park, down to Pahala in Ka'u. And this area in Ka'u really hadn't seen very much nene for a very long time either. So it's very interesting to see, you know, how they're moving and how they're where they're going, especially since you know, they're such curious animals, and they tend to get in trouble if they get into areas where there's lots of people. And case in point, you know, the population on Hawaii Island doubled after the translocation. So with more nene, we have more conflicts. Again, they are social animals. They seem to really like to follow people and to see where people are. So they end up getting into trouble. They end up in parks. They end up walking where fishermen are fishing. This picture here is of a nene with hooks in its feet. And then the picture on the right is down in Ka'u. They weren't used to seeing nene out there. They started seeing nene eating, you know, there's a bunch of small farms. Apparently the nene were eating some vegetables that they were growing, and the farmer got upset. And this here is a pellet from a pellet gun. And we never caught the guy, but you know, these are the things that happen when, you know, we end up getting so many nene, and nene end up coming into areas where people don't want them. So the nene was downlisted in 2019. And just to give you a quick note on that, the population in 2019 was estimated to be 3,492 statewide, which is a huge amount. And there was probably over 1,000 on the Big Island. So their population increased quite a bit, you know, more than doubled. And that in itself created issues, but is also, you know, kind of what we want, right? We want more nene, but now we have to figure out how to deal with it again. So again, you know, we find nene all over the place now. In parks, this is a park in Hilo on the bottom right. Park in Hilo, especially after COVID, we noticed that the nene, because of the lockdowns, people were allowed in the park. A bunch of nene. You only see one in that picture, but the rest are ducks. But there were over 30 nene at Wailoa. The years previous, there were probably 3. So we go down there, and we, you know, if we see people feeding them, we ask them not to. We create, we work with golf courses and resorts. This person, Tim Cook, he created his own sign because he was worried because there's so many nene that suddenly appeared at his golf course and his resort. So to get people to stop feeding the nene, to slow down, he created his sign. And so, you know, working with him and people like him has been very helpful, especially since, you know, most of the resorts are on the other side of the island, and I'm in East Hawaii. So it's about an hour and a half to drive to the other side of the island. And a lot of times I don't get as much time to spend on that side of the island to, educate the people and work with the resort. So it's really good that they can take it upon themselves to do such things. This is one of the saddest pictures I've taken. Communities really love their nene. This picture on the left was taken down in Paradise Park in Puna, and they have signs, their own signs, saying nene crossing, and they love their nene. But the problem is they love their nene to the point where they harm them. They feed them, and that's the hardest thing is to, people, if they like an animal, they want to feed them to get them used to them. And that's kind of comes natural to people. You want an animal to be, to like you. You want to show an animal that you like them, so you want them to like you. You feed them. So these people, they feed the birds. And of course, once they get used to people, they're not afraid of people, and they're not afraid of what people do. So people drive. They end up, people feed them on the roads or close to the road. Nene don't get scared of the road, and they get run over. Unfortunately, these two nene were struck by cars, and these other two nene in the background, I think they're the offspring. They were confused and they didn't know what to do. These particular nene, they ended up leaving the area, but they didn't know where to go. So we ended up getting lots of phone calls of these birds in people's backyards all throughout Lower Puna. And it's not, and it's strange because, the normal areas where nene are found, open grassy areas, that's not where they ended up. These two ended up in people's backyards with lots of trees and not very grassy areas. So, to continue our efforts, it'll take ongoing management efforts. We'll continue to manage and monitor. We also rely a lot on multi-agency support, adaptively manage our populations as new things pop up, be able to quickly respond to them. And we also, need long-term dedicated staff to support. And, with the downlisting of the nene, a lot of times people, they think that because you downlisted the bird, you don't need to put as much effort into them. Nene, because they're so social, I think it requires more work. They end up concentrating in these areas, near people, and they get hurt because of it. So, like that picture with the nene in the park with the hooks in his feet, or a lot of times end up at golf courses and, golf balls strike them. But, at the same time, these areas are the areas where nene want to be, and the areas where apparently they do well at. So it becomes a balancing act, and being able to respond to them when they're injured becomes more and more important as their populations increase. So this is my last slide. Just wanted to show you guys what the sounds of a bunch of nene are. And this sound is, it was very interesting back in 2013 because back then you didn't hear so many nene in one area. Now it's probably becoming more regular, but it's very common. So is there any questions? I think we should have time.
Thank you so much, Raymond. That was amazing. I don't know if you can see the chat box, but I can read it too. Roy asks, how many of the translocated Nene made it back to Lihui?
None of them. So I think that the two that I mentioned that ended up flying to Oahu, I think they were trying to make it to Kauai, and they didn't quite make it there in time to nest. So they ended up nesting on Oahu. But I mean, that's just a guess. But otherwise, we haven't found any return to Kauai.
And another question looks like from Marvin. Are the Nene still being banded so we know what island they're coming from?
Yeah, so we do band them by island. So different islands get different colors. On the Big Island, we have green bands right now, but there's also some red bands, black bands from a long time ago. But on the Big Island, we also have Nene that are banded. If you see them with gray bands, they translocated birds from Kauai. So they're from Kauai and they came to the Big Island.
Okay, and then Rob Stacy said he wasn't able to see the slides actually. So I don't know if other people had problems with that. I was able to see the slides. However, your audio was spotty, but it did get better when you turned off your video. But we will have, someone asked, we will have a recording of this that we'll send out to the people, the same people that were invited. Checking if anyone's hand is up. Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions. Gregory says, very interesting and great video.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Raymond, and thank you so much to all our panelists. We did have some time at the end for questions, but because we ran a little over on the presentations, we were scheduled to close at noon. So, Chief, did you have some closing words?
I think it was very, very interesting. Raymond, your sanctuary, is that at the 10-mile marker?
It's more like the 22-mile marker, further up.
Very, very interesting, your work and how you brought them along. I like the progression of your presentation along with everyone else's presentation.
Wow.
Great, very educational.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janelle, for moving this whole effort forward. And I hope that it seems like we had a lot of, I think the tops I saw 83 people signed on, so that's great. And I hope we have the same level tomorrow.
Yes. And tomorrow we have another great lineup of speakers. So I hope you can all join us again. And if you know anyone who's interested, the invite is, you can forward the invite or the flyer. Okay, thank you all so much. And we will see you bright and early tomorrow at 8 a.m.
All right. Thank you.
Mahalo, Janelle.
Hello.
Great job to all the speakers.